At first, it looked like it was working. Fog swallowed the forests, snow muted sound, radios failed, and through the Ardennes, a place the Allies believed too quiet, too cold, too exhausted for a major attack, German forces surged forward with a speed that stunned everyone watching the front collapse in real time. This was the Ardennes Offensive, a last gamble designed not to win the war, but to change it, to split Allied armies, to seize ports, to force negotiations before reality closed in completely. For a few dangerous days, it felt possible. American lines bent and broke. Units were surrounded. Entire roads vanished into chaos. The offensive carried surprise, momentum, and desperation. The most dangerous combination in war. But beneath the surface, the operation was already bleeding from wounds it could not survive. Because the Ardennes Offensive did not fail for one reason. It failed for many, quietly, simultaneously, and without mercy. Fuel was the first enemy. German columns advanced faster than their supply lines could follow. Tanks that broke through did so on borrowed time. Gambling that captured fuel would appear ahead. Often, it did not. Vehicles were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they ran dry in forests where movement itself was punishment. The weather helped, until it didn't. Fog grounded Allied aircraft and shielded the advance. But weather is never loyal. When the skies cleared, the balance of power returned instantly. Roads filled with wreckage, columns were exposed. Air superiority, patiently waiting, reasserted itself with devastating effect. Then there was time. The entire plan depended on speed, on seizing bridges intact, on keeping pressure unbroken. But every delay, at a crossroads, a village, a stubborn defensive stand, drained the offensive of its most valuable resource. Units like those at Bastogne did not need to win outright. They only needed to hold. And by holding, they began to unravel the timetable that everything depended on. Leadership fractured under pressure. Command decisions clashed. Objectives shifted mid-advance. Coordination dissolved between formations moving on separate axes. The offensive demanded precision from an army no longer capable of sustaining it. Experienced crews were gone. Replacements were rushed. Equipment shortages forced compromises that no plan could overcome. And looming over it all was the simple truth of scale. The Allies could absorb loss. They could reroute supply. They could shift entire armies under pressure. Germany could not. When the counterattacks came, they came with weight. Fresh units, overwhelming artillery, restored air power. The bulge began to shrink, not because of one decisive blow, but because the offensive had exhausted itself. Momentum vanished. Fuel ran out. The initiative slipped away and never returned. By the time the fighting ended, the result was unmistakable. The offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. Germany had expended irreplaceable resources. The Western Front stabilized, stronger than before. What was meant to be a reversal became an acceleration toward defeat. The Ardennes Offensive failed because it asked too much of too little. Too much speed without fuel. Too much coordination without communication. Too much hope placed on surprise in a war already decided by endurance. It stands as a lesson written in snow and wreckage, that boldness without sustainability does not change outcomes. It only hastens them. Tonight, we return to that frozen gamble, to the forests where momentum died quietly, to the plans that could not outrun reality, to the reasons why the last great German offensive in the West collapsed under its own weight. This is the story of why the Ardennes Offensive failed. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment and hear from you. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? And what time is it for you there? Is this a late-night listen, an early morning start, or a quiet moment carved out just to sit with history? And if these long, thoughtful journeys into the past help you slow down, reflect, or truly understand how wars unravel, I hope you'll consider subscribing. If this feels like a place you want to return to, then stay with me. Settle in. This is why the Ardennes Offensive failed. September 16th, 1944. Deep inside the Wolf's Lair fortress complex in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler collapsed. His personal physician rushed to his bedside as tremors racked his body and sweat soaked through his uniform. For 3 days, the Führer of the Third Reich remained in his bunker bedroom, curtains drawn, while the war he had started raged across 2 continents. When he emerged on September 19th, hollow-eyed and unsteady, he carried with him a leather portfolio containing hand-drawn sketches and a single declaration that would seal the fate of hundreds of thousands of men. He had conceived, he told his inner circle, the operation that would change everything. The plan itself seemed to materialize from fever rather than strategy. Hitler's closest military advisors, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keidel and Colonel General Alfred Jodl, listened in mounting horror as their supreme commander traced his finger across a map of the Ardennes forest. His hand, shaking slightly from what doctors privately suspected was Parkinson's disease, drew a sweeping arc from the German border through Belgium to the port city of Antwerp, 120 miles through enemy territory, through the same forests where German panzers had achieved their greatest triumph in 1940. The Führer's eyes gleamed with something his generals recognized as dangerous, the conviction of a desperate man who had confused memory with possibility. He was reaching for a ghost from the past, trying to resurrect a victory from a time when Germany had fuel, aircraft, and the element of surprise. The numbers told a story that Hitler refused to hear. By October of 1944, Germany could muster 55 divisions across the entire Western Front. The Allies deployed 96. German fuel reserves stood at approximately 4.5 million gallons, barely enough to sustain defensive operations, let alone an offensive thrust requiring at least 12 million gallons to reach Antwerp. Production capacity in the Ruhr industrial region had been devastated by Allied bombing. Factories that once produced 3,000 tanks per month now struggled to deliver 600. The Luftwaffe, which had darkened the skies over Poland and France, could barely protect German cities from daylight bombing raids. Yet, Hitler's plan demanded total air superiority, massive armored formations moving 60 miles per day, and the capture of Allied fuel depots along the way to sustain an advance that existing supplies could not support. On October 11th, Hitler summoned his senior field commanders to the Wolf's Lair for the formal presentation of what he had codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, a deliberately defensive-sounding name designed to mask offensive intentions. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, listened with growing disbelief. Field Marshal Walter Model, commander of Army Group B, stared at the map with the expression of a man watching a car crash in slow motion. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German armored doctrine and now chief of the General Staff, interrupted the presentation to warn that the Eastern Front was on the verge of collapse and that stripping reserves from the East would invite disaster. Hitler's response was not military logic, but mystical certainty. The West would be won, he insisted, and then Germany could turn its full strength against the Soviets. The order of operations mattered less than his will to see them through. The target Hitler had selected revealed both his strategic vision and his detachment from reality. Antwerp, the massive Belgian port through which 75% of Allied supplies flowed into Europe. Capturing it would, theoretically, cut off 4 Allied armies from their supply base, create a pocket of isolated forces that could be destroyed, and force the Americans and British to negotiate. It was the same logic that had worked in 1940 when German armies had cut off and surrounded Allied forces at Dunkirk. But Hitler's comparison ignored every factor that had made 1940 possible. In that year, Germany had attacked with 141 divisions supported by complete air superiority against an enemy caught by surprise and poorly coordinated. Now, in late 1944, Germany would attack with 28 divisions, no air cover, against an enemy with unlimited supplies, complete intelligence networks, and 4 years of combat experience. Model and von Rundstedt understood the impossibility immediately. In a rare moment of coordination, they developed what they called the small solution, a more modest attack aimed at encircling American forces east of the Meuse River rather than driving all the way to Antwerp. It was still ambitious, perhaps even reckless, but it existed within the realm of what German logistics could theoretically support. They presented their counterproposal to Hitler on October 27th. His reaction was volcanic. He accused them of defeatism, of lacking the willpower that had carried Germany to its greatest victories, of being contaminated by the soft thinking of the professional military caste. The plan would proceed as he had designed it, Antwerp or nothing. When Model tried to explain that nothing was the mathematically certain outcome given current fuel supplies, Hitler dismissed him from the meeting. The generals who left the Wolf's Lair that day carried with them an impossible burden. They knew the operation would fail. They knew that the fuel did not exist, that the reserves being stripped from other fronts would create catastrophic vulnerabilities, that the weather conditions necessary for success would last perhaps a week at most before Allied air power resumed its devastating attacks. They knew, in the precise mathematical way that quartermaster reports and logistics tables revealed truth, that they were being ordered to execute a plan that could not succeed. Yet they also knew that refusing the order would result in their immediate dismissal, possible execution, and replacement by officers who might care even less about the lives of the soldiers under their command. So they saluted, returned to their headquarters, and began planning an offensive they understood was doomed before the first soldier stepped across the start line. The planning pseudonym itself, Wacht am Rhein, revealed the paranoia and desperation pervading German high command. By naming the operation after a famous German patriotic song about defending the Rhine River, Hitler hoped to convince Allied intelligence that Germany was preparing defensive positions, not massing for attack. Every document referred to defensive preparations. Radio traffic suggested units were being repositioned to counter an expected Allied thrust. Fuel and ammunition were stockpiled in forward depots under the cover of reinforcing existing lines. It was an elaborate deception that required tremendous effort and, ironically, consumed resources that the coming offensive desperately needed. The Germans were spending fuel to hide fuel, using trucks to transport the very vehicles that would later be unable to advance for lack of transportation. By mid-November, the scale of what Germany was attempting became clear to the officers charged with execution. 28 divisions, more than 250,000 men, were being concentrated in the Eifel region opposite the Ardennes forest. 1,420 trains were required to move this force into position, but the shattered German rail network could manage only 70 trains per day. The mathematics meant that assembly would take weeks, increasing the risk of detection and consuming valuable autumn weather before the attack could begin. Tanks, assault guns, and artillery pieces moved at night along forest roads, covered by camouflage nets during daylight hours. Soldiers were forbidden from writing letters home. Radio silence was absolute. All communications traveled by motorcycle courier or landline telephone. It was the largest German offensive operation since the invasion of the Soviet Union, and it was being prepared by an army that lacked the fuel to sustain it, the air cover to protect it, and the strategic reserves to reinforce it. The final element of Hitler's plan was perhaps the most telling indicator of how far Germany had fallen from the confident power that had swept across Europe 4 years earlier. The entire operation depended on capturing American fuel dumps along the route of advance. German tanks would drive forward until their fuel gauges neared empty. Then, the plan optimistically assumed, they would overrun Allied supply depots, refuel from captured stocks, and continue the advance. It was planning by wishful thinking, a strategy that assumed the enemy would cooperate in their own defeat by leaving millions of gallons of fuel conveniently positioned for German use. It assumed American commanders would not demolish fuel stocks before retreating. It assumed German forces could capture depots faster than Americans could evacuate them. It assumed, most fantastically, that even if some fuel was captured, it would be compatible with German engines and available in quantities sufficient to sustain an offensive requiring hundreds of thousands of gallons per day. The plan to capture Antwerp began with the assumption that the enemy would fuel the very tanks attacking them. From this foundation of fantasy, everything else followed. November 7th, 1944. Colonel Friedrich August von der Heydte spread reconnaissance photographs across the map table at 6th SS Panzer Army headquarters and felt something he had not experienced in months: hope. The images, taken by high-altitude Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft during a rare clear-weather mission, showed the American defensive positions in the Ardennes sector. Or rather, they showed the absence of American defensive positions. Long stretches of forest with no visible fortifications, roads with minimal traffic, villages occupied by what appeared to be rear echelon units rather than combat formations. Von der Heide, a veteran paratroop officer who had fought in Crete and Normandy, counted the positions visible in the photos and calculated defender density. His conclusion was startling. The Americans were holding 80 miles of front with perhaps 4 divisions. 50 miles per division. In modern defensive doctrine, anything over 15 miles per division was considered dangerously thin. The Ardennes had become what soldiers on both sides called the ghost front. American commanders, pressured to concentrate forces for offensives in the north toward the Ruhr and in the south toward the Saar, had thinned their lines in the Ardennes to skeletal levels. The sector was considered quiet, a place where veteran divisions went to rest, and new divisions went to gain combat experience in a supposedly non-threatening environment. The reasoning was sound from a strategic perspective. The Ardennes forest, with its narrow roads, steep valleys, and limited mobility, seemed unsuitable for the kind of armored warfare at which the Germans excelled. The terrain that had channeled panzer divisions in 1940 now seemed more obstacle than opportunity. American intelligence officers looked at the same forests and concluded that Germany lacked the fuel and the forces for major offensive operations anywhere, let alone in terrain that nullified their primary advantages. German intelligence officers, starved for good news, saw something different in those reconnaissance photos. They saw vulnerability. The 88th Corps, responsible for defending the northern sector, consisted of the 99th Infantry Division and the 2nd Infantry Division, one green, one exhausted. The center was held by the 106th Infantry Division, which had arrived in Europe only 5 days before. The southern sector fell to the 28th Infantry Division, badly depleted from fighting in the Hürtgen Forest. If German intelligence was correct, the entire Ardennes sector was defended by fewer than 70,000 men against a planned German attack force of 250,000. The numbers suggested that breakthrough was not just possible, but probable, at least in the initial assault. What happened afterward would depend on how quickly American reinforcements could arrive, and whether German logistics could sustain the advance long enough to exploit the breakthrough. But intelligence is only as valuable as the conclusions drawn from it, and German intelligence in late 1944 was trapped in a distorting echo chamber of hope and desperation. Analysts who suggested the Ardennes weakness might be temporary, or that American reserves could respond faster than anticipated, found their reports sidelined. Those who emphasized American vulnerability and slow reaction times found their assessments promoted to Hitler's desk. The intelligence process had reversed itself. Instead of collecting information to inform decisions, Germany was collecting information to justify decisions already made. Von der Heide's reconnaissance photos were accurate, but the interpretation that followed assumed a static enemy who would react slowly and predictably to German moves. It assumed American commanders would not have contingency plans. It assumed that thin defenses meant weak defenses. Meanwhile, across the lines, American intelligence was failing in an entirely different way. The network that had given Allied commanders unprecedented insight into German plans, Ultra, the code-breaking operation that decrypted German military communications, was going blind. Hitler's insistence on radio silence meant that the intelligence source that had exposed German intentions from North Africa to Normandy was producing nothing but silence. American commanders, accustomed to reading German plans almost as fast as German generals received them, interpreted the silence as evidence that Germany lacked the capability for major operations. They were correct about German weaknesses, but wrong about German intentions. The absence of evidence was treated as evidence of absence. When decrypts did appear, showing unusual Luftwaffe activity and suspicious rail movements, analysts explained them as defensive preparations rather than offensive buildup. On December 3rd, an ultra-decrypt revealed increased Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over the Ardennes. On December 6th, another intercept showed German fighter units being withdrawn from the Eastern Front to bases in the west. On December 10th, reports reached First Army headquarters of German patrols actively probing American lines, testing defenses, and withdrawing before contact. These were the classic signatures of pre-offensive reconnaissance. Colonel Benjamin Dixon, the intelligence officer for First Army, assembled these fragments into a warning memorandum on December 12th. He wrote that German forces were capable of launching a spoiling attack in the Ardennes sector, possibly aimed at disrupting American offensive operations. He estimated German strength at 4 divisions, a dramatic underestimate, but still a warning. His report was filed, acknowledged, and functionally ignored. General Edwin Seibert, intelligence chief for 12th Army Group, had already issued his assessment. It is now certain that attrition is steadily sapping the strength of German forces on the Western Front, and that the crust is thinner, more brittle, and more vulnerable than it appears. The German deception operation, meanwhile, was achieving success beyond what its planners had dared hope. The assembly of 28 divisions, more than 400,000 men when supporting units were included, was proceeding within 20 miles of American positions, yet Allied intelligence detected nothing definitive. German soldiers moved only at night. Vehicles operated with engines muffled and lights extinguished. Artillery moved into firing positions under cover of darkness and remained silent until the moment of attack. Radio silence was absolute. Communications traveled by messenger and landline. When Allied aircraft penetrated German airspace for reconnaissance, they saw only what appeared to be normal defensive positions. The greatest German deception of the war was not elaborate fakery, but radical simplicity. Say nothing, transmit nothing, and let the enemy's assumptions fill the silence with reassuring fantasies. The failure of American intelligence was compounded by institutional overconfidence. After the breakout from Normandy, the race across France, and the liberation of Paris, many American officers believed German defeat was inevitable and imminent. The intelligence picture that emerged from this mindset interpreted every data point through the lens of German weakness. Increased German fighter activity meant Germany was desperately trying to protect its shrinking territory, not preparing for offensive operations. The movement of SS panzer divisions meant Hitler was shuffling forces to plug gaps, not concentrating strength for attack. The withdrawal of experienced divisions from the line meant they were being sent to rest areas, not being repositioned for a coming offensive. Every piece of evidence that might have warned of attack was interpreted as confirming that Germany was on the verge of collapse. On the evening of December 15th, officers at 8th Corps headquarters in Bastogne held a party. They had every reason to celebrate. The sector had been quiet for weeks. The most significant events were occasional patrols and the arrival of replacement troops. Christmas packages from home were being distributed. Some units had even arranged for hot turkey dinners to be served on Christmas Day. At the party, officers discussed plans for leave, rotations home, and what they would do after the inevitable German surrender in the spring. Outside, in the darkness of the Ardennes forest, 250,000 German soldiers were moving into final assault positions. In less than 12 hours, the artillery barrage would begin. The intelligence failure was complete, not because American intelligence officers were incompetent, but because they had convinced themselves that what was about to happen could not happen. The final cruel irony was that both sides had succeeded in deceiving themselves. German intelligence had identified genuine American weakness, but wildly overestimated their ability to exploit it before reinforcements arrived. American intelligence had correctly assessed German resource constraints, but completely missed German willingness to gamble everything on one last throw. Hitler had looked at reconnaissance photos and seen Dunkirk. American commanders had looked at supply tables and seen inevitable victory. Both were preparing for the battle they expected, rather than the battle that was coming. In war, the side that adapts fastest to unexpected reality usually prevails. In the Ardennes, that adaptation would be purchased with the lives of thousands of soldiers who were about to discover that intelligence estimates and battle plans rarely survive contact with a determined enemy. The Ghost Front was about to come alive with a violence that would shock both sides and reshape the final months of the war. November 2nd, 1944. In a commandeered schoolhouse outside Koblenz, 3 German quartermaster officers sat before a blackboard covered in calculations that documented an impossibility. Major Hans Joachim Kohler, responsible for fuel logistics for 6th Panzer Army, had spent the previous week working through mathematics that became more depressing with each iteration. His chalk scratched across the board: 250,000 men, 1,800 tanks and assault guns, 500 pieces of artillery, 120 miles to Antwerp. He wrote the fuel consumption rate for a Panther tank, 2 gallons per mile. For a Tiger tank, 4 gallons per mile. For supply trucks, half a gallon per mile. The numbers accumulated into a total that made his hand shake as he wrote it: 11,800,000 gallons of fuel required to reach Antwerp. Minimum. Kohler underlined this figure 3 times, then wrote below it the current available fuel stocks: 4,500,000 gallons. The shortfall was not a gap that clever planning could bridge. It was an abyss. The fuel crisis was not the only impossible equation. Lieutenant Colonel Werner Puder, in charge of ammunition supply, had calculated that the offensive required 700 tons of artillery ammunition per day to sustain operations. Current stockpiles forward of the Rhine totaled 4,000 tons, enough for less than 6 days of intensive combat. The German rail network, shattered by months of Allied bombing, could move approximately 70 trains per day westward. Each train carried 50 tons of supplies. That meant 3,500 tons per day of total supplies could reach forward areas: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, everything an army needed. Of this daily total, fuel alone would consume over 2,000 tons, leaving barely 1,500 tons for all other needs. The mathematics revealed a brutal truth. Even if everything went perfectly, even if trains ran on time and Allied aircraft never bombed the rail lines, Germany could sustain the offensive for perhaps 10 days before supply constraints forced a halt. Hitler's plan called for reaching Antwerp by day 14. The transportation bottleneck created cascading failures throughout the logistics chain. Germany had once possessed the most mechanized army in Europe, with trucks and half-tracks carrying supplies directly to forward units. By November 1944, fuel shortages had reduced mechanized transport so severely that horse-drawn wagons were being used to move artillery and ammunition. Horses that required food and water, that could not travel in darkness, that moved at walking pace, that panicked under artillery fire. The German army preparing to launch a modern armored offensive was relying on transportation technology from the previous century. Puder's calculations showed that horse-drawn transport could sustain operations for perhaps 3 divisions. The offensive required 28. The gap between requirement and reality was so vast that planning documents simply ignored it, replacing realistic calculations with optimistic assumptions. The desperate plan to bridge this logistics chasm relied on capturing American fuel dumps. German intelligence had identified major Allied fuel storage sites at Spa, Stavelot, and along the Meuse River Valley. The operational plan assigned specific Kampfgruppen, battle groups, the task of seizing these depots intact within the first 48 hours of the offensive. Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, commanding the lead battle group of 1st SS Panzer Division, received explicit orders: reach Stavelot by the end of day 1, capture the fuel depot, refuel his tanks, and continue toward the Meuse. When Peiper asked what should happen if the Americans destroyed the fuel before he could capture it, the answer revealed the fantasy underlying the entire operation. They will not have time. The plan assumed American forces would be so shocked and disorganized that they would abandon millions of gallons of fuel without destroying it. This assumption was not based on intelligence or historical precedent. It was based on necessity. Without captured fuel, the offensive would stall. Therefore, captured fuel must be available. The rail transportation crisis exposed another fundamental flaw in German planning. The offensive required moving 1,420 trainloads of men, equipment, and supplies to forward assembly areas. The German rail system, operating at maximum capacity and under constant air attack, could move 70 trains per day. That meant the assembly would require 20 days, during which time Allied reconnaissance aircraft would certainly detect the buildup, and the element of surprise would be lost. To compress the timeline, German planners decided to pre-position forces gradually over 8 weeks, disguising the buildup as routine troop rotations and defensive reinforcement. This solution created a new problem. Units sitting in assembly areas for weeks consumed food, ammunition, and fuel while waiting to attack. The supplies being stockpiled for the offensive were being consumed by the preparations for the offensive. On December 10th, 6 days before the planned attack, Kaler conducted a final fuel audit. The results were worse than his November calculations had projected. Instead of 4,500,000 gallons available, actual stocks totaled 3,800,000 gallons. German units had consumed 700,000 gallons, simply moving into position and conducting training. When Kaler presented these figures at a logistics conference, he was asked a direct question. Could the offensive reach Antwerp with available fuel? His answer, delivered in the flat tone of a man reporting undeniable facts, was no. The offensive could advance perhaps 60 miles before running out of fuel, roughly halfway to the Meuse River, far short of Antwerp. The general chairing the meeting asked how much fuel would be required to reach Antwerp. Kahler's response, 11 million gallons, nearly 3 times what was available. The meeting continued as if this exchange had not occurred. The quartermaster officers tasked with supporting the offensive understood they were being asked to perform magic. Hitler's plan required them to move an army 120 miles through enemy territory in winter, without adequate fuel, ammunition, or transport. It required them to sustain high-intensity combat operations with supply lines that could barely support defensive operations. It required them to capture enemy supplies at a rate faster than those supplies could be destroyed or evacuated. Most critically, it required all of this to occur in perhaps 7 days of bad weather before Allied air superiority returned and destroyed every vehicle moving on every road in daylight. The mathematics were unambiguous. The operation would fail from logistics constraints alone, regardless of what happened in combat. Yet the preparations continued. Officers who raised objections were told that negative attitudes undermined morale. Quartermasters who presented realistic supply calculations were ordered to revise their estimates with greater optimism. The gap between planning assumptions and logistical reality widened until it became a chasm that could only be bridged by ignoring it entirely. In the final planning documents distributed in mid-December, fuel requirements were listed as adequate for operational objectives, with a footnote explaining that captured enemy fuel dumps will supplement organic supplies. This was not planning. This was wishful thinking elevated to operational doctrine. But by December 10th, forward units were in position, ammunition was stockpiled, and soldiers were receiving final briefings. The impossible equation would be solved not through logistics, but through violence. If mathematics said the offensive would fail, then mathematics would have to be wrong. On the evening of December 14th, 48 hours before the offensive began, Kaler met privately with Pötter and the third member of their quartermaster team, Captain Ernst Wöhringer, responsible for spare parts and vehicle maintenance. They reviewed the final logistics situation over schnapps in the schoolhouse that had served as their headquarters for 6 weeks. Kaler had by now calculated that German forces had fuel for 90 kilometers of advance. Antwerp was 160 kilometers from the start line. Peter had confirmed that ammunition stocks would sustain 6 days of high-intensity combat. The offensive was planned for 14 days. Wöhringer reported that with no spare parts available, mechanical breakdowns would reduce effective tank strength by approximately 10% per day. By day 7, even tanks that had fuel would be immobile from mechanical failure. The 3 officers understood they had done everything possible to prepare for an operation that could not succeed. They raised their glasses in a silent toast to the soldiers who would soon discover what happens when national strategy collides with mathematical reality. Then they burned their most pessimistic calculations, filed optimistic reports with higher headquarters, and went to sleep. In 36 hours, the artillery would begin firing. After that, logistics would no longer be a planning problem. It would be a survival problem. December the 16th, 1944, 5:30 in the morning. Private First Class John Collins of the 422nd Infantry Regiment woke to a sound he later described as freight trains passing overhead. He was in a dugout bunker on the Schnee Eifel, a ridge formation along the German-Belgian border, and in the darkness he could not see what was making the noise. Then the first shells impacted. The ground convulsed. Timbers supporting the dugout ceiling cracked and showered dirt onto the men below. Collins grabbed his rifle and stumbled toward the entrance, but the bombardment was so intense that stepping outside meant certain death. All along the 80-mile ghost front, from Monschau in the north to Echternach in the south, 1,600 German artillery pieces were firing simultaneously. 18,000 shells in the first 90 minutes. The forest itself seemed to be screaming. The German artillery barrage, while terrifying, revealed the first fatal flaw in Hitler's plan. 1,600 guns firing 18,000 shells sounds like an overwhelming concentration of firepower, but distributed across 80 miles of front, it meant only 11 shells per gun. During Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, the opening barrage had been 3 times more concentrated. During successful Soviet offensives, artillery preparations involved 50 to 100 shells per gun, systematically destroying defensive positions before infantry advanced. The Ardennes barrage was loud and frightening, but lacked the density to suppress American strongpoints. Collins' bunker, like hundreds of others along the line, survived intact. More critically, American radio communications remained operational. Within minutes of the barrage beginning, reports were flooding back to Corps and Army headquarters. The one advantage Germany desperately needed: complete tactical surprise lasting long enough to overrun communication posts, was already evaporating. At 5:45, 15 minutes into the barrage, soldiers began reporting something that seemed impossible: searchlights. Dozens of them, pointed at 45-degree angles toward the sky. The beams reflected off low clouds and thick fog, creating artificial moonlight that turned the pre-dawn darkness into a ghostly twilight. It was a technique the Germans had used on the Eastern Front, and in the dense forests of the Ardennes, it created an eerie, disorienting glow. At 6:15, when the artillery barrage lifted, American soldiers peering from their positions saw German infantry emerging from the fog and tree line. Thousands of them, advancing in waves, their felled grau uniforms making them difficult to distinguish from the shadows. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, were the sounds of engines. Tanks. How many, nobody could tell. Lieutenant Eric Wood, commanding a forward observation post near the Losheim Gap, managed to get a radio call through to regimental headquarters at 6:30. His message was fragmentary but clear: massive infantry assault, at least battalion strength, coming from multiple directions. Before he could provide more detail, shells began impacting around his position and he went off the air. But those 8 minutes of transmission, along with similar reports from dozens of other positions, gave American commanders the one thing they needed most: information. By 7 o'clock, less than 90 minutes after the barrage began, 8th Corps headquarters knew they were facing attacks across the entire front. The strategic surprise Hitler had counted on, Allied commanders believing the attack was a local spoiling raid, never materialized. The problem facing American forces was not lack of information, but lack of forces to respond to what they knew. At St. Vith, a critical crossroads town 10 miles behind the front lines, Major General Alan Jones commanded the 106th Infantry Division from a headquarters that had been occupied for exactly 5 days. His division, fresh from training in England, had been sent to the Ardennes to gain combat experience in a quiet sector. Now, radio reports were describing attacks by what appeared to be multiple German divisions. Jones spread a map across his desk and traced the pattern of attacks. The heaviest pressure seemed focused on the Losheim Gap to his north, and the Schnee Eifel Ridge where 2 of his regiments were positioned. At 7:45, he made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered the 422nd and 423rd Regiments to hold their positions rather than withdraw. On the map, the Schnee Eifel looked like a defensible position. What Jones could not see from his headquarters was that German armored columns were already pushing through the Losheim Gap, moving to encircle his regiments from behind. 30 miles south, at Clairvaux in Luxembourg, the situation was developing with equal speed but different characteristics. Here, the 28th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Bloody Bucket for its red keystone shoulder patch and the casualties it had taken in the Hürtgen Forest, held defensive positions that were already under strength and exhausted. At 8:30, the division command post began receiving reports from 3 directions simultaneously. German infantry crossing the Our River to the east. German armor probing the main road from the north. Heavy fighting at forward positions to the south. The duty officer plotting these reports on the situation map realized with sickening clarity that his division was not facing an attack on a single axis. It was facing encirclement. By 9 o'clock, telephone lines to forward companies were going dead one by one. Not from combat damage, but because German infantry were systematically cutting them. The Americans were being isolated and surrounded before they could organize a coherent defense. The fog that had helped German infantry advance now began working against them. Visibility in the forests dropped to less than 100 yards. Units lost contact with each other. The carefully planned attack timetable, which called for armored units to rapidly exploit infantry breakthroughs, immediately fell apart. At Losheim, Kampfgruppe Paper, the most powerful German armored force in the entire offensive, sat in traffic for 6 hours waiting for engineers to reinforce a bridge that was rated for medium tanks, but collapsed under the weight of 70-ton Tiger tanks. The schedule called for Piper to be 20 miles west by noon. At noon, he had advanced 2 miles and was still waiting for the bridge repair. The terrain that had channeled German panzers so effectively in 1940 was proving equally effective at channeling them into bottlenecks in 1944. But, from the German perspective, the opening hours still looked like success. American positions were being overrun. Prisoners were being taken in substantial numbers. Artillery support was effective despite supply constraints. Infantry units were advancing against limited resistance in several sectors. The critical question was not whether the initial assault would succeed. It clearly was succeeding, but whether success could be exploited before American reinforcements arrived. German intelligence estimated that American reserves would require 48 to 72 hours to reach the battlefield. The plan depended on German armor breaking through the American front, reaching the Meuse River, and establishing bridgeheads before those reinforcements could form a defensive line. But already, in the first 6 hours, the timeline was slipping. Piper's battle group was 6 hours behind schedule. Other Kampfgruppen were reporting similar delays from traffic jams, demolished bridges, and stronger than expected resistance. By noon on December 16th, both sides understood they were in a race. For the Americans, the race was to move reserves forward fast enough to contain the breakthrough before German armor reached the Meuse. For the Germans, the race was to achieve penetration depth faster than American reserves could arrive. What neither side fully grasped yet was that this race had a third competitor: logistics. German fuel gauges were already dropping toward half empty. Ammunition expenditure in the first 6 hours had exceeded daily planning estimates. The captured fuel dumps that were supposed to sustain the advance remained in American hands, and preliminary reports suggested Americans were evacuating or destroying supplies rather than abandoning them. The opening act of the Ardennes Offensive had achieved tactical surprise, but not strategic surprise. It had penetrated the American line, but not broken it. And most critically, it had begun consuming the limited German resources at rates that made reaching Antwerp not just difficult, but mathematically impossible. The impossible equation that German quartermasters had calculated in November was beginning to solve itself on the battlefield. The answer, written in fuel consumption rates and ammunition expenditure and lengthening casualty lists, was already clear to anyone willing to read it. December 16th, 1944, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper stood beside his command half-track near Losheim, 9 miles from his start line, and consulted his watch for perhaps the 30th time that hour. According to the operational timeline given to him 6 days earlier, his Kampfgruppe should now be approaching Stavelov, 25 miles into the American rear, preparing to seize the fuel depot that would sustain his drive to the Meuse River. Instead, he was stalled at a reinforced bridge, watching engineers work with agonizing slowness, while his column of 100 tanks, 5,000 men, and 600 vehicles stretched back along a single-lane forest road for 15 miles. The bridge, adequate for the Panthers and Mark IVs at the front of his column, had collapsed under the weight of his Tiger tanks. Now those same Tigers, the most powerful tanks in his formation, were trapped behind a bottleneck that was consuming the one resource Piper could not replace: time. Piper's frustration was compounded by orders that made little military sense but perfect SS sense. 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte. Adolf Hitler was Hitler's personal guard unit, and 6th SS Panzer Army Commander Sepp Dietrich had made clear that Piper's Kampfgruppe would be first through the American lines, first to the Meuse, and first to earn the glory of this operation. But being first meant taking the northernmost route through the most heavily forested terrain, along the narrowest roads, across the most bridges. A speed required roads that could support rapid movement. Piper had been assigned roads that could barely support single-file movement. When the bridge finally opened at 8 o'clock that evening, 18 hours after the offensive began, Piper had lost 6 hours to a logistical failure that planning should have anticipated. His lead elements roared forward into the darkness, exhausted drivers peering through the narrow vision slits of their vehicles, navigating by moonlight and memory through forests that all looked identical. At 11 o'clock that night, Piper's column reached Lanzerath, where according to the plan, he should have found the 3rd Parachute Division holding open a corridor for his advance. Instead, he found a single parachute battalion that had captured the town but advanced no further. The battalion commander explained that American resistance ahead was strong and his casualties had been heavy. Piper's response, delivered with cold fury, became famous in German accounts of the battle. "What kind of paratroopers are you, afraid of a handful of Americans?" He ordered the paratroops to lead his armor forward immediately. What followed was a night movement through enemy territory that was either brilliant improvisation or reckless desperation, depending on which historian later analyzed it. Piper's tanks drove through the darkness without reconnaissance, without infantry support. Gambling that speed and shock would compensate for tactical disadvantage. It worked, but it consumed fuel at rates far exceeding planning estimates. Panthers that should have had 300 miles of range were burning through fuel in 1/10 that distance, simply navigating forest tracks in low gear. December the 17th, 4 o'clock in the morning. Piper's lead elements approached a crossroads near Bastogne, just south of Malmedy. American trucks appeared on the road ahead. A supply convoy of Battery B, 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, unaware that German tanks had penetrated so far behind the lines. Piper's tanks opened fire. Within minutes, the American vehicles were burning, and approximately 120 soldiers were surrendering. What happened next remains one of the most controversial incidents of the war. The American prisoners were herded into a field. SS soldiers opened fire with machine guns. 86 Americans died in what became known as the Malmedy Massacre. Survivors who escaped into the woods carried news of the atrocity back to American lines, where it spread with incendiary speed. The murders achieved nothing militarily. Piper's column continued moving, abandoning the bodies, but they accomplished something strategically catastrophic for Germany. American soldiers who heard about Malmedy fought with a fury born of outrage. Surrender rates dropped. Resistance stiffened. Piper had gained perhaps 30 minutes by massacring prisoners rather than securing them. He had lost any possibility that American forces might surrender rather than fight to the death. By noon on December 17th, Piper's spearhead reached Stavelot and confronted the moment his entire operation depended on: the fuel depot. From a hilltop outside town, his reconnaissance officer watched through binoculars as American trucks frantically loaded fuel drums and evacuated northward. The depot held 2.5 million gallons, enough to fuel Piper's entire Kampfgruppe to Antwerp and back. But between Piper and that, fuel stood a bridge over the Amblève River, defended by a single American M10 tank destroyer and a platoon of engineers. For 4 hours, Piper's advance guard fought to take the bridge while American rearguard forces evacuated the depot. By the time German tanks finally crossed the Amblève, the fuel depot was empty. Piper had reached the objective his operation depended on and found it useless. His tanks had consumed 140 gallons per vehicle in the last 24 hours. His fuel trucks carried enough for perhaps another 30 miles. After that, unless he captured another depot, his Kampfgruppe would become the world's most powerful collection of immobile steel. December 18th, 8 o'clock in the morning. Piper pushed forward to Stoumont, 3 miles from Spa, where 1st Army headquarters and another massive fuel depot were located. American commanders, finally grasping the danger, rushed the 30th Infantry Division into blocking positions. For the first time since breaking through the front lines, Piper faced not scattered American troops, but a prepared defense by a full-strength division. His Tigers and Panthers achieved tactical penetrations, but could not break through. By afternoon, American infantry had infiltrated around Piper's flanks. His radio operator delivered a message that Piper had been dreading. Other Kampfgruppen that were supposed to be advancing parallel to him were still fighting at the initial breakthrough points. The 12th SS Panzer Division was stalled at the twin villages. The 3rd Parachute Division had failed to widen the corridor. Piper's spearhead had driven deep into American territory, but the shaft of the spear, the follow-on forces that should have been protecting his flanks and supply lines, had not followed. The tactical situation dissolved into a nightmare familiar to any military officer who has outrun their supply lines. Piper's tanks were scattered across 15 miles of narrow road from Stavelot through Trois Ponts to Stoumont. American forces were closing in from both flanks. His fuel situation was critical. Perhaps 50 miles of range remaining in his vehicles, nowhere near enough to reach the Meuse, let alone Antwerp. His radio messages to division headquarters became increasingly desperate. On December 18th at 2 in the afternoon, he transmitted a message that summarized his entire situation in 11 words. Send fuel or send orders to retreat. Can do neither without orders. The response came back 6 hours later. Continue mission, fuel being dispatched. But no fuel arrived. The trucks carrying it were trapped behind American roadblocks. The airdrop that was promised never materialized because the Luftwaffe lacked aircraft and fuel for such operations. By December 19th, Piper understood his situation with perfect clarity. He was surrounded. He had fuel for perhaps 20 miles of movement. His casualties were mounting. American forces were crushing his extended flanks. The operation that had begun 60 hours earlier with the objective of reaching the Meuse River by December 20th had instead created a pocket of isolated German forces 30 miles from the start line with no prospect of advance or resupply. Piper made the decision that planning should have made before the offensive began. He ordered his vehicles destroyed and his men to break out on foot. Of the 5,000 men who had started the advance, approximately 800 reached German lines. 100 tanks and assault guns were abandoned. The most powerful Kampfgruppe and 6th SS Panzer Army had been destroyed not primarily by enemy fire, but by the mathematics its own quartermaster officers had calculated in November. Without fuel, armor becomes immobile. Without mobility, armor becomes a target. The spear point had not penetrated American defenses so much as it had embedded itself in those defenses and broken off. The failure of Piper's drive revealed something more fundamental than tactical defeat. The entire German plan had assumed that speed and shock could compensate for logistics constraints. It assumed that if armor could penetrate quickly enough and deep enough, fuel could be captured before exhaustion forced a halt. It assumed that roads could support rapid movement, that bridges would hold under tank weight, that American forces would be too disorganized to respond effectively. Every assumption proved wrong. The roads became bottlenecks. The bridges collapsed or were demolished. The Americans reorganized with shocking speed and fought with unexpected ferocity. And the fuel that was supposed to be there for the taking had been evacuated or destroyed before German tanks could reach it. Piper's race had been run at maximum speed against an opponent who controlled the fuel supply. There could only ever be one outcome. The only surprise was that German high command had convinced itself there could be another. December 16, 1944, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Colonel George Deschenaux of the 422nd Infantry Regiment stood in his command post on the Schnee Eifel and studied a map that showed something impossible. Reports from his forward companies indicated German forces attacking from the east, as expected in a defensive sector, but new reports, fragmentary and confused, suggested German units had been spotted to his west and north, behind his positions. Deschenaux traced potential German movements on the map and reached a conclusion that made his hands shake. His regiment, along with Colonel Charles Cavender's 423rd Regiment, positioned beside him, was being encircled. 8,000 American soldiers were about to be cut off on a forested ridge with limited supplies and no easy route of withdrawal. They had been in Europe for 5 days. Most of his men had never heard shots fired in anger before this morning. Now they were about to be trapped. The Schnee Eifel, German for snowy mountains, though it was more ridge than mountain, had seemed like good defensive terrain when the 106th Division took over the sector. The elevated positions provided observation over approaches from the east. The forests provided concealment. The roads, though limited, appeared adequate for supply and reinforcement. What division planners had not considered was that the same geography that made the ridge defensible from the front made it a trap if attacked from multiple directions. German forces, advancing faster than American intelligence had predicted possible, had pushed through the Losheim Gap to the north and the region near Bleyauf to the south. By afternoon of December 16th, German units were behind the Schnee Eifel, cutting roads and establishing blocking positions. The regiments on the ridge suddenly found themselves in a pocket, surrounded, with their supply lines severed. Colonel Cavender requested permission to withdraw at 5 o'clock on December 16th. Division headquarters denied the request. Major General Jones, commanding the 106th Division, believed the breakthrough was temporary and that American forces would soon restore the line. He ordered both regiments to hold their positions and prepare for relief. That relief would require breaking through German encirclement, but Jones was confident it would arrive within 24 hours. His confidence was based on incomplete information and pre-war doctrine that assumed American reserves could respond to breakthroughs within 1 or 2 days. What Jones did not know, what nobody at division headquarters understood yet, was that the entire 8th Corps sector was collapsing. The reserves that should have been moving to break the encirclement were instead being rushed to defend Saint-Vith, Bastogne, and a dozen other critical points. The 2 regiments on the Schnee Eifel were on their own. December 17th. The pocket tightened. German artillery began systematic bombardment of American positions. Food supplies, already limited because the sector had been considered quiet, became a concern. More critically, ammunition expenditure was far exceeding planning estimates. Soldiers who had been issued 200 rounds per rifle were down to fewer than 50. Machine gun crews rationed bursts. Artillery forward observers requested fire missions and were told to conserve ammunition for critical targets only. The weather, which had been cold but clear, deteriorated into snow and fog. Visibility dropped. The forests, already claustrophobic, became mazes where American and German patrols stumbled into each other at ranges of 20 yards. Casualties mounted from firefights that erupted without warning and ended just as suddenly when both sides pulled back into the fog. On December 18th, American commanders attempted to organize a breakout. The plan called for both regiments to attack southward toward Schönberg, punch through the German encirclement, and link up with division forces at St. Vith. It was the kind of operation that required air support, artillery preparation, and armor support, none of which were available. The weather prevented air operations. American artillery outside the pocket could not provide fire support because forward observers inside the pocket had lost radio contact. And armor support was impossible because there were no tanks inside the pocket and no way to get them there. At dawn on December 19th, 8,000 American soldiers prepared German defensive positions with rifles, machine guns, and desperation. The attack began with determination, but collapsed within hours. German machine gun fire cut down the lead companies. Mortars targeted assembly areas. The snow and forest channeled the attack into predictable corridors where German defenses were strongest. By noon, the breakout had failed. At 1 o'clock on December 19th, German loudspeakers began broadcasting messages into the pocket. The voice, speaking clear English with only a slight accent, promised that soldiers who surrendered would be treated as prisoners of war under Geneva Convention protocols: hot food, warmth, medical care for the wounded. The alternative, the voice explained with cold logic, was death from starvation, cold, or artillery fire in a position that could not be relieved. Both regimental commanders, Deschenaux and Cavender, knew the loudspeaker broadcasts were psychological warfare, but they also knew the claims were accurate. Their men were surrounded, outnumbered, running out of ammunition with no prospect of relief. The temperatures had dropped below 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Wounded soldiers were dying from exposure because medical supplies had been exhausted. Attempts to airdrop supplies had failed because of weather. The pocket had become a death trap. At 2:30 on the afternoon of December 19th, after consultation with their battalion commanders and with division headquarters radio contact lost, Deschenaux and Cavender made the decision that neither had imagined making when they deployed to Europe. They ordered their regiments to surrender. White flags appeared along the American positions. Firing gradually stopped. German soldiers, many of them as exhausted and cold as the Americans, moved forward to accept the surrender. By evening, approximately 8,000 American soldiers were prisoners, the largest mass surrender of U.S. forces since Bastogne in 1942. The news, when it reached American newspapers weeks later, would cause shock and recrimination. How could an entire division lose 2 regiments in 3 days? But the Schnee-Eifel surrender, while tactically a German victory, was strategically a German failure. The 2 regiments, by holding their positions for 3 days and requiring German forces to reduce the pocket, had accomplished something more valuable than their own survival. They had tied down the 18th and 62nd Volksgrenadier divisions, 2 full German divisions, for 72 hours. Those divisions, which should have been advancing toward the Meuse, instead spent 3 days fighting a static battle to eliminate a surrounded pocket. More critically, the defense of Saint-Vith, the critical road junction 10 miles west of the Schnee-Eifel, was enabled by the time the surrounded regiments consumed. German forces that could have attacked Saint-Vith on December 17th were instead committed to reducing the Schnee-Eifel pocket. By the time they finished, American reinforcements had reached Saint-Vith and transformed it into a fortress that would hold for another 3 days. The soldiers who surrendered on the Schnee-Eifel did not know they were part of a larger strategic picture. They knew only that they were cold, surrounded, out of ammunition, and abandoned by a command structure that had promised relief and delivered nothing. They surrendered not because they were cowards, but because further resistance meant dying for no purpose. Yet their 3-day defense, and even their surrender, served a strategic function. Every hour those 2 regiments fought was an hour American reserves used to move into defensive positions. Every German division committed to reducing the pocket was a division not advancing toward the Meuse. The Schnee-Eifel was not a victory for either side. It was a transaction. Germany traded time and divisions to eliminate a surrounded force. America traded 2 regiments to buy time for its defenses to solidify. In the mathematics of the Ardennes, where time was the rarest resource, America came out ahead. The final irony was that of the 8,000 soldiers who surrendered, fewer than 800 had become casualties in the fighting. The vast majority were simply trapped and out of supplies. They had ammunition for perhaps 6 more hours of combat, food for 1 more day, and no prospect of either resupply or relief. Their surrender was not a failure of will, but an acknowledgement of mathematics. They could not fight without ammunition, could not survive without food, and could not break out against forces that outnumbered them and controlled all routes of escape. The Schnee-Eifel demonstrated what military historians had known since antiquity. Encirclement renders firepower irrelevant, morale meaningless, and determination futile. The only variable that matters is supply, and supply was the one thing the surrounded regiments did not have. They fought until fighting became impossible, then surrendered. Their service was not diminished by their surrender. If anything, their decision to hold as long as they did, consuming German time and forces, may have contributed more to eventual Allied victory than dying in a futile breakout attempt would have accomplished. December 19th, 1944, 11 o'clock in the morning. General Dwight D. Eisenhower entered a second-floor conference room in a French army barracks in Verdun and looked at faces that reflected the crisis gripping the Western Front. General Omar Bradley, commander of 12th Army Group, looked like he had not slept in days. General George Patton, never one to hide his emotions, radiated aggressive energy barely contained by military protocol. General Jacob Devers, commanding 6th Army Group to the south, studied maps with the expression of a man calculating risks. Eisenhower had called this emergency conference to address a German offensive that had, in 72 hours, transformed from a local attack into a strategic crisis. The room was cold despite a struggling coal heater. Maps covered every wall, and everyone present understood that decisions made in this room would determine whether the Ardennes breakthrough became a catastrophic defeat or merely an expensive setback. Eisenhower opened the meeting with a statement that would be remembered by everyone present. He said, and his words were recorded by multiple officers, "The present situation is to be regarded as one of opportunity for us and not of disaster." The silence that followed suggested not everyone agreed with this assessment. American forces were in retreat across an 80-mile front. 2 regiments had been cut off. German armor was approaching the Meuse River. 1st Army headquarters had evacuated Spa. Fuel dumps were being destroyed or evacuated under pressure. Casualties were mounting. This, to most officers in the room, looked like disaster. But Eisenhower's strategic vision operated on a different scale. The Germans, he explained, had committed their strategic reserve to an offensive that was pulling them away from prepared defensive positions. If that offensive could be contained and then counterattacked, Germany would lack the reserves to defend anywhere else. The crisis, properly managed, could become an opportunity to destroy German forces rather than simply push them back. The first critical decision concerned command structure. The German breakthrough had split Bradley's 12th Army Group into 2 pieces. 1st Army and 9th Army north of the breakthrough could barely communicate with Bradley's headquarters south of the Bulge. Telephone lines were cut. Radio communications were sporadic. Bradley was attempting to command forces he could not effectively reach. Eisenhower's solution was elegant and politically explosive. He would temporarily transfer command of 1st and 9th Armies to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group. Montgomery, whose headquarters was north of the breakthrough and in good communication with American forces in that sector, would coordinate the northern response. Bradley would retain command of 3rd Army and coordinate the southern counterattack. The military logic was sound. The political implications were volatile. American commanders serving under British command. The headlines would be brutal. Bradley's face showed he understood the implications, but he did not argue. The situation demanded coordination more than it demanded pride. The second decision concerned timing and objectives. Patton, invited to present his plan, delivered a characteristic performance. Eisenhower asked when 3rd Army could attack northward to relieve Bastogne. Patton answered, December 22nd, 3 divisions. The room went silent. It was December 19th. Patton was claiming he could pivot his entire army 90 degrees, move more than 100,000 soldiers and all their equipment 100 miles north, and attack in 72 hours. During winter, through the Ardennes, staff officers began calculating whether this was physically possible. The numbers were staggering. 3rd Army consisted of 6 divisions plus supporting units, approximately 250,000 men. Moving that force required 11,000 trucks carrying fuel, ammunition, food, and equipment. It required coordinating movement along roads that were already clogged with retreating units and evacuating civilians. It required establishing new supply lines, new command posts, new communications networks. Patton, seeing skepticism, doubled down. He explained that he had already prepared contingency plans for exactly this scenario. For the past 3 days, while continuing his offensive toward the Saar, he had directed his staff to plan 3 separate options for attacking north. Each plan involved different numbers of divisions on different timelines. The plan for attacking with 3 divisions by December 22nd was already complete. Orders were drafted, routes were selected, supply points were designated. All he needed was Eisenhower's authorization to execute. The room's atmosphere shifted from skepticism to something approaching awe. Patton was demonstrating the hallmark of effective military leadership, anticipating contingencies before they occur. While other commanders were still trying to understand the scope of the crisis, Patton had already planned the counterattack. Eisenhower authorized Patton's plan. Third Army would pivot north and attack toward Bastogne with 3 divisions, the 4th Armored, the 26th Infantry, and the 80th Infantry. If the attack succeeded in relieving Bastogne, additional divisions would flow north and expand the counteroffensive. Bradley would coordinate this effort with Montgomery's operations in the north. The objective was not merely to contain the German breakthrough, but to counterattack from both flanks, pinch off the salient, and trap German forces in a pocket of Allied making. It was an ambitious plan that depended on American logistics operating at maximum efficiency, while German logistics continued deteriorating. The meeting participants understood. They were betting that American trucks, fuel supplies, and command flexibility could overcome the temporary German advantage of interior lines and concentrated forces. The logistical implications of Eisenhower's decision revealed the fundamental difference between American and German strategic mobility. Third Army's movement north required 800,000 gallons of fuel just for the initial displacement. That was more fuel than Germany had allocated to the entire Ardennes Offensive. American trucks would move 133,000 men, 11,000 vehicles, and 62,000 tons of supplies in 72 hours. Germany had required 6 weeks to move 250,000 men into position for their offensive, and had done so only by operating at night and maintaining radio silence. The United States would accomplish a comparable logistical feat in 3 days, in daylight, while maintaining radio communications and under potential air attack if weather cleared. The disparity in logistics capability was so vast that it almost constituted a separate category of military advantage. Montgomery's role in the northern sector immediately became controversial. While American commanders appreciated the military logic of unified command, they chafed at the political implications of British command over American forces. Montgomery's reputation for caution and methodical preparation clashed with American preferences for aggressive action. Eisenhower's decision to split command was militarily necessary, but created friction that would persist throughout the battle. Bradley felt his authority had been undermined. Patton openly criticized Montgomery in conversations with staff officers. The alliance, already stressed by competing national interests and command personalities, was now navigating one of its most severe tests. Yet the decision held because military necessity trumped national pride. The alternative, Bradley attempting to command forces he could not effectively communicate with, would have resulted in uncoordinated responses and potentially catastrophic defeat. By the time the Verdun conference ended at 2 o'clock that afternoon, the Allied response to the Ardennes Offensive had been fundamentally reoriented. Instead of defensive containment, the strategy now emphasized counterattack. Instead of fragmented responses by individual units, operations would be coordinated at Army group level. Instead of focusing on holding ground, the emphasis shifted to destroying German forces. Eisenhower's guidance to his commanders was simple: fix German forces in place with defensive operations, then hit them from both flanks with overwhelming force. It was textbook military doctrine executed at a scale and speed that would test whether Allied logistics could actually deliver what Allied planning promised. The immediate challenge was time. Patton needed 72 hours to attack. The 101st Airborne, racing north to defend Bastogne, needed time to establish positions before German forces arrived. St. Vith needed to hold long enough for defenses to solidify elsewhere. Every hour of delay imposed on German forces was an hour American reinforcements used to organize, reposition, and prepare. The race that had started on December 16th, with German forces attempting to reach the Meuse before American reserves arrived, had now become a more complex equation. Could American forces move faster than German forces could advance? Could logistics support movements at the required pace? Could command and control function effectively across the chaos of a mobile battle in winter conditions? The decisions made at Verdun on December 19th represented Eisenhower's bet that the answer to all these questions was yes. The next week would determine if he was right. December 19th, 1944, 9 o'clock in the evening. Lieutenant Colonel Ned Moore of the 101st Airborne Division stood in the back of a truck, watching the lights of Bastogne appear through the darkness ahead. His men, crammed into open trucks without winter gear, because the division had been pulled from reserve positions so quickly there had been no time to issue proper equipment, were shivering in temperatures that had dropped below 20 degrees. They had traveled 107 miles in vehicles that broke down, on roads clogged with refugees and retreating units, following maps that were often wrong. Moore checked his watch and realized they had covered the distance in less than 24 hours, a logistical achievement that would have been considered impossible a week earlier. Now, as the trucks rolled into Bastogne's outskirts, he could hear artillery fire in the distance. The Germans, according to fragmentary radio reports, were perhaps 10 miles away. The race to Bastogne had been won by hours, not days. Bastogne itself was unremarkable, a Belgian market town of 4,000 civilians located at the intersection of 7 hard-surface roads. Under normal circumstances, it would merit perhaps a paragraph in a tourist guidebook describing its medieval architecture and local breweries. But in December 1944, those 7 roads made Bastogne the most strategically critical piece of real estate in the Ardennes. Every major road in the region passed through or near the town. Any German advance toward the Meuse required using those roads. The alternative was cross-country movement through forests and hills that would reduce armored mobility to a crawl. German planning had identified Bastogne as an objective that should fall by December 18th. Instead, on the evening of December 19th, the Germans discovered that the town was being reinforced by American paratroopers renowned for their combat effectiveness. The accidental fortress was about to become deliberate. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, artillery commander of the 101st Airborne, temporarily commanding in the absence of the division's regular commander, established his headquarters in the Heinz barracks on the western edge of town. His staff spread maps across tables and immediately grasped why they had been sent here with such urgency. The 7 roads radiating from Bastogne were visible on every map, routes north to Liège, south to Arlon, east toward Saint-Vith, west toward the Meuse. Control those roads, and you controlled movement through the entire southern Ardennes. The German plan to reach the Meuse required at least 3 of those roads. McAuliffe's mission, delivered in typically concise military language, was to deny them. How long he needed to hold was left unstated, but everyone understood the implication. Until Patton's Third Army arrived from the south. How long that would take was anybody's guess. December 20th. German forces began probing Bastogne's perimeter from multiple directions. The 26th Volksgrenadier Division approached from the east. The 5th Parachute Division pushed from the north. Elements of Panzer Lehr Division maneuvered toward the western approaches. What these units discovered was that the 101st Airborne had been reinforced by remnants of other units that had retreated into Bastogne, elements of the 10th Armored Division. Artillery battalions, engineers, headquarters personnel pressed into infantry service. The defenders numbered approximately 18,000 men, not a large force, but positioned in a town that channeled attacks into predictable corridors. German commanders faced an unpleasant choice: bypass Bastogne and leave a strong enemy force controlling the roads behind them, or take Bastogne and consume time and forces that the offensive could not afford. The German decision to attack Bastogne rather than bypass it revealed the same inflexibility that was dooming the entire offensive. Military doctrine suggested that fortified positions should be bypassed by mobile forces and reduced by follow-on infantry. But the Ardennes terrain meant that bypassing Bastogne would force German supply columns onto secondary roads barely capable of supporting truck traffic, much less armor. The main supply routes ran through Bastogne. If German forces continued west without taking the town, their supply lines would be vulnerable to American counterattacks from Bastogne's garrison. Doctrine said bypass. Geography said attack. German commanders chose geography and committed forces to a siege operation that their timeline could not support. Every hour spent attacking Bastogne was an hour not spent advancing toward the Meuse. December 22nd, the siege intensified. German artillery bombardment increased. Infantry attacks probed American positions looking for weak points. American casualties mounted. Medical supplies ran low. Food stocks, never adequate, became a concern. McAuliffe's staff calculated that, with rationing, they had supplies for perhaps 4 more days. Ammunition was more critical. Artillery batteries were down to 10 rounds per gun. Infantry units were collecting ammunition from casualties. Machine gunners were ordered to fire only at identified targets. The weather remained overcast, preventing air resupply. The cloud ceiling was below 1,000 feet. Visibility less than 1 mile. Transport aircraft could not fly. Fighter bombers could not provide close air support. The garrison was isolated, surrounded, running out of everything. At 11:30 on the morning of December 22nd, 2 German officers approached American lines under a white flag. They carried a message addressed to the American commander, demanding surrender within 2 hours. The message invoked the well-known American humanity and warned that continued resistance would result in total annihilation. McAuliffe's response became one of the most famous single words in American military history. He read the surrender demand, laughed, and dictated his reply, "Nuts." His staff officers, concerned that the German officers might not understand American slang, considered translating it into more formal military language. McAuliffe refused. "Nuts" was delivered to the German officers, who required explanation of its meaning. When told it meant the American commander refused to surrender and suggested the German commanders go to hell, the officers returned to their lines. The siege would continue. December 23rd. The weather, which had protected German movements for a week, finally cleared. Dawn broke with visibility stretching for miles under a pale blue sky. At American airfields in France, transport aircraft loaded with supplies began taking off. Fighter bombers armed themselves for ground attack missions. The aerial armada that had been grounded for a week was about to make up for lost time. At 9:30 in the morning, the first C-47 transport aircraft appeared over Bastogne. Paratroopers on the ground fired recognition flares. The transports dropped lower, and colored parachutes blossomed across the sky. Red for ammunition, blue for medical supplies, yellow for food, white for miscellaneous equipment. Over the next 3 days, transport aircraft would fly 962 sorties, delivering 241 tons of supplies. The aerial supply line transformed the siege from a race against starvation into a sustainable defense. The clear weather that enabled American resupply also enabled American air power to target German forces surrounding Bastogne. P-47, Thunderbolts, the workhorse fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force, appeared over German positions and began systematic destruction of tanks, vehicles, and artillery positions. A German tank column attempting to reinforce the siege was caught in the open and destroyed in less than an hour. Artillery positions that had been shelling Bastogne with impunity were identified from the air and hit with precision bombing. The Luftwaffe, unable to contest American air superiority due to fuel shortages and losses from recent operations, could provide no protection. German soldiers, who had operated freely under cloud cover for a week, now discovered what it meant to fight without air cover against an enemy with complete air superiority. They moved only at night, hid vehicles under trees, abandoned broken-down equipment rather than stopping to repair it in daylight. December 26th, 4:45 in the afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, led his Sherman tanks through the final German defensive lines south of Bastogne and reached the town's perimeter. The relief column had fought through 40 miles of defended terrain in 4 days, averaging 10 miles per day against determined German resistance. Abrams's lead tank pulled up to the American defensive positions, and an officer called out, "How are you, General?" McAuliffe, who had walked forward to meet the relievers, responded with characteristic understatement. "Gee, I am mighty glad to see you." The siege was lifted. Bastogne remained in American hands. The road junction that German planning required was denied to them. The offensive, already behind schedule, was now impossible. There were no alternative routes. There was no bypassing Bastogne. The town stood across the path to the Meuse like a boulder in a stream, forcing German forces to flow around it and losing momentum in the process. The defense of Bastogne demonstrated what the entire Ardennes offensive was proving, that terrain and logistics matter more than tactical excellence. German forces had achieved local superiority, executed coordinated attacks, and employed combat-experienced troops. They had been defeated not by superior tactics, but by geography that channeled their movements and logistics that could not sustain those movements once channeled. The 7 roads that made Bastogne important also made it defensible. The same narrow approaches that would have facilitated German supply if they had captured the town became killing zones when they failed to capture it. The forests that had concealed German assembly before the offensive now prevented German armor from maneuvering effectively. Every advantage that terrain and geography provided evaporated once the operation transitioned from surprise attack to sustained combat. Bastogne held because it was easier to defend a road junction than to capture one, easier to supply a garrison from the air than to reduce it from the ground, and easier for American reserves to reach the town than for German forces to take it while simultaneously advancing westward. The mathematics of logistics and geography had asserted themselves, and no amount of tactical skill could alter that equation. December 15th, 1944, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Captain James Howard, a meteorologist attached to the 9th Air Force, studied weather reports from observation stations across Western Europe and delivered a forecast that would shape the coming battle. A massive low-pressure system was moving in from the Atlantic, bringing with it dense cloud cover, fog, and snow. The system would settle over the Ardennes region for at least 5 days, possibly longer. Cloud ceilings would drop below 2,000 feet. Visibility would decrease to less than 1 mile. Flying conditions would be impossible for all but the most desperate missions. Howard filed his report with IT, Tactical Air Command, noting that the forecasted weather would ground Allied tactical air operations across the entire front. What he could not know was that German meteorologists were reading the same data and reaching the same conclusions. Hitler's offensive was being launched not despite the weather, but because of it. The Allied air forces that had dominated European skies since D-Day represented overwhelming firepower that Germany could not match. The 9th Air Force alone operated more than 3,000 tactical aircraft, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and P-51 Mustangs, configured for ground attack. The 8th Air Force added thousands of heavy bombers that could strike strategic targets or, in emergencies, provide tactical support. The Royal Air Force contributed additional fighter bombers and medium bombers. Against this armada, the Luftwaffe could field perhaps 1,800 operational aircraft, many flown by pilots with minimal training and crippled by fuel shortages. In clear weather, German ground forces could not move in daylight without being destroyed from the air. The weather forecast that Captain Howard filed on December 15th was simultaneously the best news German commanders had received in months, and a ticking clock counting down to their destruction. German planning for the Ardennes Offensive incorporated weather as a critical operational factor. Hitler's personal meteorologist predicted 7 to 10 days of overcast conditions starting December 16th. The offensive timeline was built around this forecast. Breakthrough and exploitation during the period of bad weather. Reach the Meuse before skies cleared. Establish defensive positions before Allied air power could fully respond. It was a plan that depended on meteorological predictions proving accurate, on schedules being met despite logistics constraints, and on achieving objectives faster than weather systems moved. By December 16th, when the offensive began under skies thick with fog and low clouds, German commanders must have felt that nature, at least, was cooperating. The question was whether 7 days of clear skies would be enough to reach objectives that logistics and terrain were already making unachievable. For Allied aircrew, the grounding of their aircraft was a source of intense frustration. Major General Elwood Pete Quesada, commanding 9. Tactical Air Command, spent December 17th driving through the battle area in a jeep because he could not fly. His reconnaissance was limited to what he could see from ground level through fog and snow. What he saw was alarming. German columns moving freely on roads that, in clear weather, would have been death traps. German tanks advancing without concealment because they knew Allied aircraft were grounded. German supply trucks operating in the daylight hours without fear of air attack. Quesada returned to his headquarters and ordered his staff to prepare maximum effort operations the moment weather cleared. Every available aircraft would hit German targets. The supplies Germans were moving freely now would be paid for in destroyed vehicles later. The weather that grounded Allied aircraft had a perverse secondary effect. It reduced the effectiveness of Allied artillery. Artillery forward observers, who normally called in fire missions on visible targets, found their observation ranges reduced to a few hundred yards in fog and snow. Artillery that might have devastated German assembly areas instead fired blind based on map coordinates and estimated enemy positions. Accuracy dropped dramatically. German forces, operating under concealment of weather, suffered fewer casualties from artillery than they would have in clear conditions. The weather advantage Hitler had counted on was delivering exactly what he had hoped: several days during which German forces could move and fight without facing the full weight of Allied firepower. But this advantage came with a built-in expiration date. Eventually, the weather would clear. When it did, German forces would be exposed and vulnerable, far from their start lines, with fuel stocks depleted and no ability to rapidly retreat. December 22nd. Allied meteorologists detected the first signs that the weather system was breaking up. High-altitude winds were shifting. The low-pressure system that had dominated the region for a week was beginning to move east. Forecasts predicted partial clearing on December 23rd, full clearing by December 24th. The news spread through Allied air bases with electric speed. Ground crews worked through the night, preparing aircraft for maximum effort operations. Munitions specialists loaded bombs, rockets, and ammunition. Intelligence officers prepared target folders identifying every known German position, supply route, and concentration area. The Allied air forces, grounded and frustrated for a week, were about to deliver a week's worth of pent-up violence in a matter of days. December 23rd, dawn. The cloud ceiling over the Ardennes lifted to 3,000 feet. Visibility improved to 5 miles. At Allied airfields across France, Belgium, and England, engines roared to life. The first aircraft took off at 7 o'clock in the morning. By noon, the sky over the battlefield was filled with Allied aircraft operating in a target-rich environment. German columns that had moved freely in daylight for a week suddenly found themselves under constant air attack. P-47s dove on tank formations, destroying vehicles with 500-pound bombs and rockets. Medium bombers struck German supply depots and railroad junctions. Even heavy bombers, normally reserved for strategic targets, were diverted to tactical missions, hitting German troop concentrations with devastating effect. The Luftwaffe attempted to contest the skies and was swept aside. German fighters were outnumbered, outflown, and destroyed at rates they could not sustain. The transformation in battlefield dynamics was immediate and catastrophic for German forces. Movements that had taken hours in bad weather now took all day or became impossible. Tanks that needed to move 30 miles to reach objectives were lucky to move 3 before air attacks forced them into concealment. Supply columns that had operated in daylight now could move only at night, reducing daily transport capacity by 2/3. German soldiers, who had grown accustomed to moving freely, now learned the terror of air attack, the sudden scream of diving aircraft, the explosions that walked through columns, the helplessness of ground forces against an enemy operating in 3 dimensions. The psychological impact was as significant as the physical damage. Morale, already strained by fuel shortages and stronger than expected American resistance, cracked further under constant air attack. The statistics from December 23rd through December 26th documented the impact of Allied air superiority. Allied air forces flew approximately 15,000 sorties in 4 days. The Luftwaffe managed barely 1,000. Allied aircraft destroyed 187 German tanks and assault guns, damaged hundreds more, destroyed more than 500 trucks and supply vehicles, and killed or wounded thousands of German soldiers. But the numbers understated the strategic effect. German commanders, who had planned their offensive around achieving objectives during a window of bad weather, watched that window close while their forces were still 30 miles from the Meuse. The clear skies that allowed American transport aircraft to resupply Bastogne also allowed American fighter bombers to destroy German supplies before they reached forward units. The air war that Hitler's offensive had attempted to neutralize through weather returned with multiplied force, and German forces had no defense. The Luftwaffe's weakness was not merely quantitative, but qualitative. Fuel shortages meant German pilots flew fewer training hours, producing a pilot force with limited experience. When those pilots encountered Allied fighters, flown by veterans with hundreds of combat hours, the results were predictable. German fighters were shot down at ratios approaching 10-1. The few Luftwaffe pilots who were experienced found themselves outnumbered and overwhelmed. By December 26th, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased contesting Allied air superiority over the battlefield. German ground forces operated under skies controlled by the enemy, with no prospect of friendly air support and constant threat of air attack. This was the nightmare scenario that German doctrine had warned against. Conducting mobile operations without air cover against an enemy with air supremacy. The clearing weather revealed what German commanders had desperately hoped to avoid, that their offensive had been launched on borrowed time. The weather had provided a temporary reprieve from Allied air power, but that reprieve had not been long enough to achieve objectives before the weather advantage expired. German forces were now exposed, far from their start lines, without adequate supplies, and under constant air attack. The offensive that had begun with weather as an ally now continued with weather as an executioner. Every hour of daylight brought more Allied aircraft. Every air attack destroyed vehicles Germany could not replace, consumed fuel reserves through evasive maneuvering, and degraded combat effectiveness through casualties and psychological stress. The missing air force had returned, and its return marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's gamble in the Ardennes. The skies that had been Germany's shield for 7 days became Germany's prison for the remainder of the battle. December 17th, 1944, 10 o'clock in the morning. Brigadier General Bruce Clark of Combat Command, B 7th Armored Division, drove into St. Vith after an all-night march from position 60 miles north, and immediately recognized the chaos of a headquarters that had lost control of the battle. The 106th Infantry Division command post was receiving fragmentary reports of German attacks from multiple directions, but nobody seemed to have a clear picture of where German forces were or how many were involved. Maps showed question marks and estimated positions rather than confirmed enemy locations. Radio communications with forward units were sporadic. The atmosphere suggested an organization on the verge of collapse. Clark, a combat veteran who had commanded armor in North Africa and Normandy, understood that St. Vith was about to become a critical defensive position, whether division headquarters grasped that fact or not. The road junction controlled 5 hard surface roads radiating toward the Meuse. If those roads fell to German control, the entire southern flank of the breakthrough would be open. St. Vith's importance existed precisely because of the terrain that was supposedly preventing rapid German advance. The Ardennes forests and hills that channeled armored movement made hard surface roads essential for sustaining any offensive. Secondary roads and forest tracks could support limited movement, but not the kind of sustained high-volume traffic that a major offensive required. St. Vith sat at the convergence of roads running east toward Germany, west toward the Meuse, north toward Liège, south toward Bastogne, and northwest toward the key terrain at Vielsalm. Controlling St. Vith meant controlling movement through the entire central Ardennes. German planning had identified the town as a Day 2 objective that should fall quickly once the initial breakthrough was achieved. Instead, on December 17th, German forces discovered that American armor had reinforced the position overnight and was preparing to defend. Clark's reconnaissance of St. Vith's surroundings revealed defensive advantages that less experienced officers might have missed. The town sat in a valley with ridges to the east, providing observation over German approaches. The roads, while numerous, funneled through terrain that channeled attacks into predictable corridors. The forests surrounding the town provided concealment for defensive positions, while limiting German ability to employ armor en masse. Most critically, the town's position at a road junction meant that German forces attempting to bypass it would be forced onto secondary roads that significantly slowed movement. Clark positioned his tanks on the eastern ridges, placed infantry in defensive positions covering the main approaches, and established artillery observation posts with clear fields of fire. St. Vith was not a fortress, but it was defensible by forces determined to hold it. December 18th. The battle for St. Vith began in earnest as German forces, having spent the previous day reducing the Schnee-Eifel pocket, turned their attention to the road junction. The 18th Volksgrenadier Division, supported by elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division that had been diverted from Kampfgruppe Peiper's northern route, attacked from the east and northeast. Clark's defenders, outnumbered but positioned on favorable terrain, stopped the initial assaults with concentrated artillery fire and tank gunnery. German commanders, accustomed to American forces withdrawing under pressure, discovered that the 7th Armored Division was neither green nor easily intimidated. The Americans held. German casualties mounted. The timetable, already stressed, began disintegrating further. December 19th and 20th. The fighting intensified as German commanders committed additional forces to taking St. Vith. The 62nd Volksgrenadier Division joined the attack from the south. German artillery bombardment increased in intensity. American positions came under pressure from 3 directions simultaneously, as German forces attempted to encircle the town. Clark's defenders gave ground slowly, establishing successive defensive lines that forced Germans to fight for every mile. American artillery, firing from positions west of St. Vith, delivered defensive fires with devastating accuracy. German tank attacks that should have overrun American positions instead bogged down in killing zones, where American tank destroyers and Shermans engaged German armor at ranges where American guns were effective. The fighting devolved into a series of close-range engagements, where German numerical superiority was negated by terrain and American defensive skill. On December 20th, German commanders faced a choice that revealed the strategic bankruptcy of their position. St. Vith was holding out far longer than planned. German forces that should have been advancing toward the Meuse were instead committed to a static battle for a single town. The schedule called for reaching the Meuse by December 20th. Instead, on December 20th, German forces were still fighting for a town, 10 miles behind what should have been their front line. Doctrine suggested bypassing strong points and allowing follow-on forces to reduce them. But the Ardennes road network made bypassing impractical. The roads controlled by St. Vith were the roads German supply columns needed. So German commanders continued attacking, committing more forces to taking a town that was consuming time and divisions the offensive could not afford to lose. December 21. American commanders, recognizing that St. Vith's garrison was in danger of being cut off, ordered Clark to begin withdrawing. Montgomery, now commanding American forces in the northern sector, preferred establishing a stronger defensive line to the west, rather than holding isolated positions that could be encircled. Clark began the withdrawal after nightfall on December 21st, executing a fighting retreat that extracted most of his force intact. By dawn on December 22nd, German forces occupied St. Vith. They had achieved their objective, but the achievement came 5 days late according to the offensive's timetable, and the delay had cascading effects throughout the German advance. 5th Panzer Army, which should have been approaching the Meuse, was still 40 miles from the river because its route had been blocked by the defense of St. Vith. The offensive's timeline, already strained by logistics failures and stronger than expected resistance, was now irrecoverable. The 7-day defense of St. Vith represented one of those moments in military history where tactical defeat masks strategic victory. The American defenders eventually withdrew under pressure, They lost ground, equipment, and casualties. By conventional measures, they lost the battle. But the purpose of defending St. Vith was not to hold the town forever, but to delay German forces long enough for Allied reinforcements to establish stronger defensive positions elsewhere. In this objective, the defense succeeded completely. Every day St. Vith held was a day American reserves used to move into position. Every German division committed to taking St. Vith was a division not advancing westward. Every hour consumed in fighting for the town was an hour that German fuel stocks depleted and American defenses solidified. The casualty exchange at St. Vith illustrated the mathematics of defensive operations in favorable terrain. American forces defending the town suffered approximately 3,400 casualties over 7 days, a significant loss for a single division, but sustainable given American replacement capacity. German forces attacking the town suffered approximately 5,000 casualties, and lost time they could not replace. The strategic calculation was stark. America could replace casualties in weeks, could replace equipment in days, but could manufacture time only through defensive operations that consumed German schedules. St. Vith consumed 7 days of schedule, and those 7 days proved impossible to recover. The Meuse River, which German planning called for reaching on December 20th, remained out of reach on December 27th. The offensive that should have covered 120 miles in 14 days had advanced 60 miles in 11 days and was running out of fuel, time, and options. The defense of St. Vith also revealed German command and flexibility at the operational level. Experienced commanders might have recognized that St. Vith had become a resource trap, a position consuming forces disproportionate to its value, and bypassed it even at the cost of using secondary roads. But German doctrine, German command culture, and German operational planning all emphasized seizing objectives rather than bypassing them. The plan said, "Take St. Vith," so German forces took St. Vith, regardless of whether taking it still served operational objectives by the time it fell. This inflexibility, replicated at Bastogne and across the entire front, transformed what might have been a mobile armored offensive into a series of static battles for towns and road junctions. Each battle consumed time, each delay compounded the next, and each town that held for even a few days contributed to the collapse of a timeline that had been unrealistic from the moment it was conceived. December 17th, 1944, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Major Rolf Kunkel, logistics officer for the 116th Panzer Division, stood on a hill overlooking the Belgian town of Houffalize and watched through binoculars as American trucks evacuated a fuel storage facility 3 miles away. Intelligence reports had identified this location as containing approximately 25,000 gallons of gasoline, enough to refuel Kunkel's entire division and continue the advance toward the Meuse. The plan had been simple: break through, capture fuel depots before Americans could evacuate them, refuel, and continue. But the Americans, somehow still organized despite the surprise attack, were implementing denial operations faster than German forces could advance. Kunkel watched the last trucks disappear over the ridgeline and checked his watch. His lead elements would reach the depot in approximately 45 minutes. He already knew what they would find: empty storage tanks, or, worse, burning storage tanks that Americans had destroyed rather than leave intact. The strategy of capturing American fuel to sustain the offensive had always been optimistic. It assumed Americans would be too surprised and disorganized to implement denial procedures. It assumed German forces could reach fuel depots faster than Americans could evacuate them. It assumed captured fuel would be compatible with German engines and available in quantities sufficient to sustain operations. Each assumption proved wrong. American commanders, as soon as they grasped the scale of the German offensive, issued orders to evacuate or destroy fuel stocks at risk of capture. Engineer units prepared demolitions. Quartermaster units organized evacuation convoys. The fuel that German planning counted on began disappearing before German forces could reach it. When Kunkel's lead tanks reached the Houffalize depot at 2:45, they found exactly what he had feared: 300 gallons of gasoline in a facility that had held 25,000 gallons that morning. 300 gallons. enough to refuel approximately 10 tanks one time. Insulting. The Spa fuel depot represented an even more dramatic example of evacuation efficiency defeating German planning. Spa, a Belgian town 15 miles southwest of the German start line, housed the largest American fuel storage facility in the forward area, 2.5 million gallons. German intelligence had identified this depot as critical to sustaining the offensive. Joachim Peiper's Kampfgruppe, driving north and west through American positions, was ordered to reach Spa by December 18th and secure the fuel before it could be destroyed. At 3 o'clock on the afternoon of December 17th, Peiper's reconnaissance elements reached positions where they could observe Spa. What they saw was an evacuation operation of stunning efficiency. American trucks were loading fuel drums and driving north in continuous convoys. Tank trucks were being topped off and dispatched. What could not be moved was being destroyed. Engineers were preparing demolitions at fuel storage tanks. Peiper recognized the situation immediately. Even if his forces fought through to Spa in the next few hours, they would arrive too late. The attempt to reach Spa illustrated the cruel mathematics of fuel consumption versus fuel capture. Peiper's tanks consumed approximately 240 gallons of fuel, covering the distance from their start line to the outskirts of Spa. If they fought their way into the town against American defenders, which would require several more hours of combat operations, they would consume another 60 gallons per tank. That meant each tank would expend 300 gallons to potentially capture enough fuel to refuel once. And that calculation assumed the fuel was still there when they arrived, which the evacuation convoys suggested it would not be. Peiper made the battlefield decision that his operational orders should have made. He bypassed Spa and continued west, hoping to find another fuel source. By the time his forces turned away, American engineers had completed the evacuation. 2.5 million gallons that might have sustained German armor all the way to the Meuse had been moved beyond German reach in less than 6 hours. The technical incompatibility of captured fuel created a problem German planners had not anticipated. American gasoline was refined to 80-octane standards to suit American engine designs. German tanks were tuned for 74-octane fuel. The higher octane caused increased engine temperatures and accelerated wear on engine components designed for lower-grade fuel. German tank crews who captured American fuel and used it reported engine problems, overheating, loss of power, increased mechanical failures. Some commanders refused to use captured American fuel precisely because they understood it would damage their engines. The irony was bitter. German forces were literally surrounded by fuel they could not effectively use, hunting for fuel that did not exist in capturable quantities, while their own supplies dwindled toward empty. By December 19th, the pattern was clear across the entire offensive front. German forces were reaching fuel depots hours or days after Americans had evacuated them. Panzer Lehr Division captured a depot at Wiltz, containing enough fuel for precisely 10 tanks. 2nd Panzer Division's reconnaissance element discovered a fuel dump near Bastogne that had been destroyed by American engineers 30 minutes before German forces arrived. The ground was still burning. 3rd Parachute Division located an intact fuel storage site only to discover it contained diesel fuel for trucks, useless for their gasoline-powered vehicles. The fuel hunt had become a grim scavenger operation, where German forces expended fuel searching for fuel they would not find. The operational plan's dependence on captured supplies was not merely failing, it was accelerating German fuel exhaustion. The mathematics of fuel capture versus consumption documented an impossible situation. From December 16th through December 26th, German forces in the Ardennes Offensive captured approximately 50,000 gallons of usable fuel from American stocks. Over the same period, German forces consumed approximately 3 million gallons. The captured fuel represented less than 2% of consumption. To make the math even more stark, German forces needed to capture 200,000 gallons per day to sustain operations. They were capturing 7,000 gallons per day on average. The shortfall was not a gap that could be bridged through better execution or tactical success. It was a structural impossibility embedded in the operational plan. The offensive could not capture fuel faster than it consumed fuel because Americans were destroying fuel faster than Germans could capture it. December 21st. 2nd Panzer Division, the deepest German penetration of the offensive, reached Celles, 4 miles from the Meuse River. They could see the river valley from hilltop positions. The Meuse crossings, the intermediate objective that would open the route to Antwerp, were tantalizingly close. But 2nd Panzer Division had no fuel remaining. Their tanks had consumed the last reserves during the approach to Celles. Behind them, the supply route was under constant American pressure. No fuel trucks were reaching forward units. The division commander requested immediate resupply and was told that fuel trucks were trying to get through but were blocked by American counterattacks and airstrikes. On December 24th, American forces counterattacked Celles and found German tanks abandoned without fuel. The furthest German advance of the offensive ended not in a climactic battle, but in empty fuel tanks 4 miles short of an objective that might have been reached if planning had matched resources to requirements. The Great Fuel Hunt revealed the delusion underlying the entire Ardennes offensive. German commanders had convinced themselves that audacity and speed could overcome logistics constraints. They had designed an operation that required 12 million gallons of fuel and started it with 4.5 million, betting they could capture the difference from the enemy. This was not planning. It was magical thinking. Worse, it was predictable failure. Every German quartermaster officer who studied the plan understood it would fail from fuel exhaustion. Every logistics calculation showed the math did not work. Yet the offensive proceeded anyway, consuming Germany's last operational reserves in a gamble that mathematics proved was impossible before the first shot was fired. The fuel depots that were supposed to sustain the drive to Antwerp were evacuated, destroyed, or incompatible. The tanks that were supposed to reach the Meuse ran out of fuel and were abandoned. And the offensive that was supposed to change the war instead demonstrated what happens when national strategy ignores logistics reality. It fails expensively, predictably, and completely. The final irony was that German forces, desperately searching for fuel, were literally swimming in fuel while simultaneously drowning from lack of it. The American military was so fuel-rich that evacuation operations sometimes left small quantities behind, because collecting every gallon was less important than evacuating quickly. German soldiers reported finding 5-gallon jerry cans of gasoline abandoned beside roads, individual drums hidden in buildings, small caches that Americans had deemed too minor to bother securing. These tiny quantities, a few hundred gallons here, a few dozen gallons there, were useless for sustaining armored operations, but tantalizing evidence of American logistics abundance. Germany was fighting a war where its most powerful offensive could not find enough fuel to sustain mobile operations. America was fighting a war where it sometimes abandoned more fuel during retreats than Germany captured during advances. This disparity, more than any tactical consideration, explained why the Ardennes offensive failed. You cannot win a mobile war when your tanks are immobile. You cannot sustain an offensive when the enemy destroys supplies faster than you can capture them. And you cannot bridge a 3 million gallon fuel deficit through optimism, willpower, or tactical excellence. The great fuel hunt was over before it began, and the hunters had become the hunted. December the 31st, 1944, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Oberleutnant Hans Hartigs of Jagdgeschwader. 3 stood in a briefing room at Paderborn Airfield, listening to orders that seemed to confirm every rumor that had circulated through the Luftwaffe for the past 2 weeks. Operation Bodenplatte, ground plate, would commence at dawn on January 1st. 900 German fighters would strike 16 Allied airfields in Belgium, Netherlands, and northern France simultaneously. The objective: destroy Allied aircraft on the ground before they could take to the air, cripple Allied tactical air power, and give German ground forces in the Ardennes breathing room from constant air attack. Hartig studied the map showing his unit's assigned target, an American airfield near Brussels, and tried to ignore the voice in his mind that said this operation was madness. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a shadow of its former strength, was about to gamble everything it had left on a single surprise attack. If Bodenplatte succeeded, Allied air superiority might be temporarily degraded. If it failed, the Luftwaffe would cease to exist as an effective fighting force. The planning for Bodenplatte revealed both German desperation and German organizational capability. Coordinating 900 aircraft from bases across Western Germany to strike 16 targets simultaneously required logistic sophistication that seemed incongruous with Germany's collapsing military situation. Each pilot received detailed briefing materials, aerial photographs of target airfields, approach routes designed to avoid Allied radar detection, timing schedules synchronized to the minute. The pilots would fly at low altitude, below 500 feet, to avoid radar. They would maintain radio silence to prevent Allied interceptors from vectoring toward them. They would achieve complete surprise and destroy Allied aircraft before effective resistance could organize. The plan was technically sound. Its fundamental problem was that it consumed resources Germany could not replace and depended on achieving surprise against an enemy whose intelligence networks had repeatedly proven capable of detecting German operations. The Dawn mission briefing on January 1st revealed aspects of the operation that disturbed even experienced pilots. Many of the pilots flying Bodenplatte had fewer than 50 hours of flight time. The Luftwaffe's training pipeline, decimated by fuel shortages and Allied bombing of training bases, was producing pilots with minimal experience. These pilots would be attacking heavily defended Allied airfields in daylight, while flying at altitudes where even small arms fire was lethal. More troubling was the requirement for radio silence during the approach. Experienced pilots understood this meant that if one formation encountered problems, others could not be warned. The coordination that had been achieved through detailed planning could evaporate the moment unexpected circumstances emerged, and combat always produced unexpected circumstances. January 1st, 1945, 8 o'clock in the morning, 900 German fighters crossed into Allied-held territory and achieved complete surprise. Allied radar operators, accustomed to minimal German air activity, initially dismissed the contacts as friendly aircraft. By the time the truth became clear, German fighters were over their targets. At Brussels-Yverdon, German planes strafed parked American aircraft, destroying 144 planes on the ground. At Eindhoven in Netherlands, German fighters destroyed 100 Allied aircraft in less than 30 minutes. At Saint-Tron, at Le Culot, at Maelsbroek, German pilots pressed home attacks against aircraft that could not fight back. For 20 minutes, Bodenplatte looked like a stunning success. Then Allied anti-aircraft defenses came fully alert, and the operation began to disintegrate. The cost of surprise was casualties that German pilot training could not sustain. Allied airfields were defended by concentrated anti-aircraft artillery that created death zones through which attacking aircraft had to fly. German fighters, pressing attacks at low altitude to achieve maximum effectiveness against ground targets, flew directly through these zones. The flak anti-aircraft fire was devastating. Aircraft disintegrated in midair. Pilots who survived being hit had no altitude to recover or maneuver. They crashed and died. Of the 900 aircraft that began the operation, more than 260 were shot down over or near their targets. The Allied aircraft destroyed were replaceable within days. The German pilots killed were irreplaceable, period. Germany had lost 100 fighter pilots at airfields. It had lost 237 pilots conducting the attacks on those airfields. The exchange rate was catastrophically negative. The operation's most absurd tragedy occurred during the return flight. German planners, obsessing over operational security, had kept Bodenplatte secret even from German anti-aircraft units. As German fighters returned to their bases, German flak gunners, unaware that friendly aircraft would be flying in daylight, opened fire on what they assumed were Allied aircraft. More than 90 German planes were shot down by German anti-aircraft fire. Pilots who had survived Allied defenses died within sight of their own airfields, killed by their own forces. The organizational paranoia that had maintained operational security had also prevented coordination with the very units that might have protected returning aircraft. Security had been preserved. German pilots had been killed by the act of preservation. By noon on January 1st, Bodenplatte was over and casualty reports were being compiled. The operation had destroyed approximately 300 Allied aircraft, most on the ground. It had cost Germany 300 aircraft and 237 pilots killed or captured. Allied aircraft production could replace 300 aircraft in approximately 4.5 days. American and British factories were producing roughly 2,000 tactical aircraft per month. German aircraft production, strangled by bombing and resource shortages, was producing approximately 600 aircraft per month. The mathematical exchange was unsustainable. Worse, Allied pilots lost in Bodenplatte numbered fewer than 50. Most Allied losses were aircraft destroyed on the ground, while their pilots were not present. Germany had traded 237 trained pilots for 50 Allied pilots and 300 aircraft. Even in a best-case analysis, this was strategic defeat masquerading as tactical success. The impact on Luftwaffe capability was immediate and terminal. Before Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe could contest Allied air operations in limited sectors for limited periods. After Bodenplatte, it could barely defend German cities from daylight bombing raids. The fighter units that had conducted the operation were effectively destroyed. Some had lost 70% of their aircraft and pilots. Replacement aircraft could be manufactured, given time and resources. Replacement pilots required months of training that Germany no longer had time to provide. The Luftwaffe, already reduced to a marginal factor in the war, had committed suicide in a spectacular attack that achieved nothing strategically valuable. Allied air superiority, which had been challenged only by weather during the Ardennes Offensive, now became air supremacy. German forces in the Ardennes could no longer move at all in daylight. Supply operations ceased during daylight hours. Tactical movement became suicidal. The sky belonged entirely to the Allies. The strategic implications of Bodenplatte's failure extended beyond the immediate loss of aircraft and pilots. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, had promised Hitler that the operation would disrupt Allied air operations long enough for ground forces to reach the Meuse. The promise had been based on optimistic assumptions about Allied response times and pessimistic assumptions about Allied anti-aircraft effectiveness. Both assumptions proved wrong. Allied aircraft losses were replaced within a week. Allied air operations over the Ardennes resumed at full intensity within days. German ground forces, instead of receiving relief from air attack, discovered that Allied air superiority had intensified. Fighter bombers now operated with impunity. Every road, every vehicle, every movement was vulnerable to air attack. The operation that was supposed to provide breathing room instead confirmed that Germany could no longer contest the skies over its own armies. The aftermath of Bodenplatte revealed the delusion that had infected German strategic thinking in late 1944. Operations were being launched not because they had reasonable chances of success, but because the alternative was accepting inevitable defeat. Bodenplatte was designed to fail slowly rather than quickly, to trade German pilots for Allied aircraft at rates that Germany could not sustain, to achieve tactical successes that contributed nothing to strategic objectives. It was, in miniature, the same pattern as the Ardennes Offensive itself. Gamble everything on a single throw, achieve surprise and initial success, then watch the operation collapse under the weight of logistics limitations and strategic overextension. The Luftwaffe had thrown its last reserve into a desperate attack. The attack had failed, and the failure was not surprising or avoidable. It was inherent in an operation that traded irreplaceable resources for replaceable losses. The sky was lost. The war in the air was over. What remained was simply documenting how long it would take for ground defeat to follow aerial defeat. The answer, in the Ardennes, was 2 weeks. December 20th, 1944, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Field Marshal Walter Model sat in his headquarters at Krefeld, studying operational reports and composing a message that he knew would enrage Hitler. The reports showed what Model's field experience had already told him. 6th SS Panzer Army's attack in the north had stalled completely, achieving virtually no penetration. 5th Panzer Army in the center had made significant progress, but was now running into stiffening American resistance and fuel shortages. 7th Army in the south was barely holding its positions against American counterattacks. The logical response, which any field commander would implement immediately, was to shift forces from the failing northern attack to reinforce success in the center. Model requested permission to redeploy at least 2 SS Panzer divisions from 6th SS Panzer Army to 5th Panzer Army. The request was militarily obvious and operationally sound. It was also a request to modify Hitler's plan, which meant it would be rejected. The response arrived 6 hours later. Hitler refused to authorize the redeployment. 6th SS Panzer Army would continue attacking on its assigned axis. The northern route to Antwerp remained the main effort, regardless of what battlefield reality suggested. Model was instructed to push harder, commit reserves more aggressively, and achieve breakthrough through willpower and determination. What the message did not acknowledge was that willpower could not manufacture fuel, determination could not repair destroyed tanks, and aggression could not overcome an enemy that outnumbered German forces and possessed air superiority. Model filed the response and returned to studying his maps. He commanded Army Group B, theoretically possessed the authority to make operational decisions, and in practice could not move a single division without Hitler's personal approval. The paralysis was not tactical or strategic. It was structural, embedded in a command system where the Supreme Commander micromanaged operations from hundreds of miles away while refusing to acknowledge battlefield realities. December 22nd. General Hasse von Manteuffel, commanding 5th Panzer Army, transmitted a request that revealed how completely German command structure had failed. His forces had achieved the deepest penetration of the offensive, were approaching the Meuse River, and faced a critical decision: bypass Bastogne and continue westward, or commit forces to taking Bastogne and consume time. Manteuffel's recommendation was clear: bypass Bastogne, leave a screening force, and drive for the Meuse before American reinforcements could establish a defensive line. The military logic was unassailable. Bastogne was a problem, but the Meuse was the objective. Taking Bastogne consumed forces and time that advancing toward the objective did not. Hitler's response came back within hours: take Bastogne. The road junction could not be left in American hands. 5th Panzer Army would commit forces to reducing the garrison. The decision violated basic military doctrine about bypassing strong points, but Hitler's reasoning was based on logistics rather than tactics. German supply routes needed the roads through Bastogne. The plan's dependence on inadequate supply routes was determining operational decisions, rather than operational opportunities determining supply routes. The command paralysis was not limited to high-level operational decisions. Even tactical reorientations required approval from higher headquarters, which meant delays of 12 to 48 hours, while requests moved up the chain of command and orders moved back down. A battalion commander who wanted to shift his forces to exploit a local opportunity had to request permission from regiment, which requested permission from division, which requested permission from corps, which requested permission from army, which sometimes requested permission from army group, which might request permission from Berlin. By the time authorization arrived, the opportunity had usually passed. American commanders, operating under a decentralized command system that emphasized initiative and rapid decision-making, could respond to battlefield developments in hours. German commanders required days to implement changes. The disparity in command agility translated directly into battlefield advantage. December 24. General Heinz Guderian, chief of the General Staff and responsible for the entire Eastern Front, arrived at Hitler's headquarters with reports that the Soviet Union was preparing a massive winter offensive. Soviet forces had concentrated armies opposite German lines in Poland and East Prussia. Intelligence suggested the offensive would begin in January. Guderian requested permission to withdraw forces from the Ardennes and redeploy them east before the Soviet attack began. He brought detailed briefings showing Soviet strength, German weakness, and the consequences of being caught unprepared. Hitler's response was predictable and catastrophic. Not one man would be withdrawn from the Ardennes until the offensive achieved its objectives. The Eastern Front would have to hold with available forces. Guderian's warning was dismissed as defeatism. The possibility that Germany was now fighting battles it could not win was unacceptable. Therefore, such warnings were lies from generals who lacked fighting spirit. The same day, Model and von Manteuffel met privately outside official channels to discuss a question that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war. Should they disobey orders? Model's situation was desperate. His forces were stalled, out of fuel, under constant air attack, and taking unsustainable casualties. The offensive had clearly failed to achieve its objectives. Continuing the attack was consuming forces that could be used to defend Germany itself against the inevitable Allied counterattacks. The generals discussed whether they had legal and moral authority to withdraw forces without authorization, to prioritize saving their armies over following orders they knew were destroying those armies. The discussion continued for 2 hours. In the end, both men decided they could not disobey direct orders from the Supreme Commander, even when those orders were clearly wrong. The consequences of the Ardennes Offensive would be borne by the soldiers who had no choice but to follow those orders. The command paralysis exemplified how centralized control systems fail under stress. Hitler's insistence on approving every operational decision meant that German responses to changing battlefield conditions were always hours or days behind American responses. When American forces counterattacked, German commanders could not respond immediately. They had to request permission, wait for authorization, then implement changes. The delay allowed American forces to consolidate advantages before German forces could respond. Worse, the requirement for approval meant that German commanders stopped thinking creatively. Officers who had been trained to exercise initiative and make independent decisions learned that initiative was punished and independence was insubordination. The result was an army that could execute pre-planned operations, but could not adapt when those plans encountered unexpected resistance. December 28. Hitler issued orders that confirmed his complete detachment from battlefield reality. The Ardennes Offensive would continue. 6th SS Panzer Army would renew attacks in the north. 5th Panzer Army would take Bastogne and resume the drive toward the Meuse. 7th Army would hold southern positions against American counterattacks. Additional forces would be committed. Victory remained achievable through determination and will. The orders ignored every report from field commanders describing fuel shortages, ammunition exhaustion, unsustainable casualties, and collapsed timelines. They ignored the fact that American reinforcements were arriving faster than German forces could advance. They ignored the reality that Allied air superiority was destroying German vehicles faster than German factories could replace them. The orders existed in a command environment where reality had become optional and preferences had replaced facts. The consequences of this command paralysis were visible across the battlefield. German forces that had achieved local successes could not exploit them because reorienting forces required approval that came too late. German units that should have withdrawn to defensible positions remained exposed because orders to withdraw never arrived. German soldiers fought and died executing plans that had been overtaken by events because nobody with authority to change those plans would acknowledge that change was necessary. The German command system, which had proven so effective in the early war when Hitler's gambles sometimes succeeded, had become a suicide mechanism. It could generate orders but could not process feedback. It could demand results but could not acknowledge when results were impossible. And it could consume armies while insisting that consumption was progress. The final tragedy was that experienced German commanders understood exactly what was happening. Model knew the offensive had failed. Von Manteuffel knew continuing the attack was destroying his army for no gain. Guderian knew the Eastern Front was about to collapse and that forces committed to the Ardennes could not be recovered in time to defend against the Soviet offensive. Every professional officer in the German military command understood that the Ardennes Offensive was now a strategic disaster, but none had authority to stop it. Authority rested with Hitler, and Hitler's conception of the war had diverged so completely from reality that reports describing actual battlefield conditions were dismissed as defeatism. The command paralysis was complete. The army that needed to adapt to survive was commanded by a system that could not adapt, and a leader who would not accept that adaptation was necessary. The result was predictable. Orders continued, attacks continued, casualties continued, and defeat which might have been limited through timely withdrawal, instead became comprehensive through stubborn refusal to acknowledge failure. December the 22nd, 1944. Dawn. Sergeant John O'Neill of the 3rd Armored Division woke in a snowdrift beside a road in Luxembourg and tried to remember where he was supposed to be. His unit had been fighting toward the Saar River yesterday. Today, according to orders that arrived after midnight, they were attacking north toward Belgium. The entire 3rd Army, 6 divisions, more than 250,000 men, had received orders to pivot 90 degrees and attack toward Bastogne. O'Neill's company had driven through the night, navigating by moonlight on roads packed with military vehicles, all moving north. They had covered 40 miles in darkness without headlights, following the vehicle ahead by watching its silhouette. Now, as dawn broke on December 22nd, O'Neill's unit was forming up for an attack into the southern flank of the German salient. The speed of the reorientation was unprecedented. No army in history had ever moved so many forces so far so fast in winter conditions. But Patton had promised Eisenhower an attack in 72 hours, and Patton kept his promises. The logistics of 3rd Army's pivot were staggering even by American standards. 133,000 men had to disengage from offensive operations in one sector and redeploy to attack in another sector 100 miles away. 11,000 vehicles required fuel for the displacement. Supply lines established for operations toward the east had to be reoriented to support operations toward the north. Artillery units had to calculate new firing data for entirely different terrain. Communications networks had to be reconfigured. The operation consumed 800,000 gallons of fuel just for the initial movement, more than twice the total fuel Germany had available for its entire Ardennes offensive. American logistics officers, operating with resources that German quartermaster staff could only imagine, executed the pivot as a routine, albeit urgent operation. December the 23rd. The 4th Armored Division, spearheading 3rd Army's attack, hit German defensive lines south of Bastogne and discovered that attacking north was dramatically harder than maneuvering east. The Germans, after achieving initial surprise and breakthrough, had transitioned to defensive operations along their southern flank. They were no longer advancing. They were defending the territory they had gained. The terrain, forests, ridges, and narrow valleys favored defense. German positions were prepared and manned by experienced units. The weather, which had grounded Allied aircraft for the first week of the offensive, had cleared, but snow and ice made off-road movement nearly impossible. 4th Armored Division attacked with determination and courage, but discovered that winter warfare in the Ardennes consumed time at rates that made Patton's timeline almost impossible to meet. The breakthrough that relieved Bastogne came not through overwhelming force, but through tactical innovation and relentless pressure. 4th Armored Division attacked along multiple axes simultaneously, probing German defenses for weak points. When resistance proved strong in one sector, they shifted forces to another sector and attacked again. The constant pressure prevented German forces from concentrating reserves. American artillery, directed by forward observers who braved German fire to call in accurate missions, systematically destroyed German strongpoints. American fighter bombers, operating in clear weather for the first time in a week, provided close air support that devastated German defensive positions. The advance was measured in yards per hour rather than miles per day, but it was advanced nonetheless. December 26th, 4:45 in the afternoon. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the lead battalion of 4th Armored Division, radioed that his tanks had reached Bastogne's perimeter. The relief had required 4 days of continuous combat, covering 40 miles. 4th Armored had started the attack with 131 medium tanks. They reached Bastogne with 79. The casualties, men and machines, documented the cost of mobile warfare in winter against prepared defenses. But the siege was lifted. Bastogne remained in American hands. The critical road junction that German planning required was permanently denied, and 3rd Army's counterattack, which had seemed impossible when Patton promised it 5 days earlier, had succeeded exactly as promised. The relief of Bastogne marked a strategic inflection point in the Ardennes battle. Before December 26th, German forces were attacking and Americans were defending. After December 26th, Germans were defending and Americans were attacking. The shift from offensive to defensive operations is always difficult, but it is particularly difficult for forces that lack the logistics to sustain static defensive operations. German forces defending their gains in the Ardennes faced the same supply problems that had plagued their offensive, compounded by Allied air attacks that made daylight movement suicidal. They could not be reinforced adequately. They could not be resupplied reliably. They could not maneuver to counter American attacks. They could only hold positions and hope that Allied attacks would exhaust themselves against German defensive skill. Third Army's attack north expanded from a single-corps operation to a multi-corps offensive that threatened to cut off German forces in the salient. By December 30th, Patton was attacking with 6 divisions along a 40-mile front. The weight of the offensive, combined with Montgomery's eventual counterattack from the north, created a vice closing on German forces. German commanders requested permission to withdraw before the vice closed completely. Permission was denied. They were ordered to hold their positions and continue contesting every yard. The result was predictable. German forces that might have withdrawn intact instead were ground down in static defensive battles that consumed men and equipment Germany could not replace. The contrast between American and German command cultures was stark. When Eisenhower asked Patton if he could attack in 72 hours, Patton's response was to check his contingency plans and say yes. When German field commanders asked Hitler for permission to adapt their operations to changing circumstances, Hitler's response was to deny requests and demand continued execution of failed plans. American command culture empowered subordinates to make decisions and act on initiative. German command culture required subordinates to request permission and wait for approval. In mobile warfare, where opportunities measure their lifespan in hours, the difference between empowered initiative and required permission was the difference between exploiting success and watching success evaporate. Patton's relief of Bastogne was not brilliant generalship in the conventional sense. It was brutal, methodical application of superior resources against an enemy who lacked the logistics to counter them. Third Army attacked with overwhelming advantages in fuel, ammunition, air support, and reserves. The attack succeeded not because of tactical brilliance, but because American logistics could sustain attacks at rates German logistics could not counter. This was industrial warfare at its most fundamental. The side with more resources, better logistics, and greater capacity to absorb losses would win through attrition. Patton understood this completely. His genius was not in tactical innovation, but in execution speed. He moved his army faster than other commanders thought possible, attacked with aggression that kept German forces off balance, and sustained offensive operations at tempos that exceeded German capacity to respond. By December 31st, Third Army had penetrated the southern edge of the German salient, threatened German supply lines, and forced German commanders to commit reserves to defending against American counterattacks, rather than continuing their offensive toward the Meuse. The operation that had begun with Eisenhower asking if Patton could attack in 72 hours had evolved into a sustained counteroffensive that was systematically destroying German forces in the Ardennes. The relief of Bastogne was not the end of the battle, but the beginning of the end. German forces, which had advanced 60 miles in 10 days, now faced the prospect of being pushed back those 60 miles, while under constant attack from an enemy who possessed every advantage except weather, and even weather had turned against them. The skies were clear, Allied aircraft ruled the air, and the fuel that German forces desperately needed to maneuver or retreat did not exist. Third Army's wheel north had transformed the Ardennes from a German offensive into an Allied counteroffensive. The question was no longer whether Germans could reach the Meuse, but whether Germans could escape the Ardennes before being encircled and destroyed. December 24th, 1944, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Major Ernst von Kochenhausen, operations officer for 2nd Panzer Division, stood beside an abandoned Panther tank 4 miles from the Meuse River and understood that the offensive was over. The tank, perfectly functional except for its empty fuel tanks, represented Germany's deepest penetration into Allied territory. From this hilltop near Celle, von Kochenhausen could see the Meuse Valley through his binoculars. The river, the intermediate objective that would have opened the route to Antwerp, was visible. 4 miles away. They had come 120 miles and stopped 4 miles short of a goal that would still have left them 60 miles from their ultimate objective. The tank's crew had walked east, joining the stream of German soldiers, beginning the long retreat. Von Kochenhausen marked the tank's position on his map and calculated what this failure meant. 2nd Panzer Division had been the spear point of 5th Panzer Army, the most successful element of the entire offensive. If they could not reach the Meuse, nobody could. The operation had failed. The collapse of 2nd Panzer Division at Celles was not a dramatic last stand, but a quiet dissolution. The division simply ran out of fuel and stopped moving. Tanks that had consumed their last gallons reaching forward positions could not withdraw when American forces counterattacked. Crews disabled their vehicles to prevent capture and retreated on foot. The most powerful armored formation in the Western Offensive disintegrated not from enemy fire, but from immobility. American forces from 2nd Armored Division, counterattacking on December 26th, discovered German tanks abandoned in defensive positions, their guns loaded, but their fuel tanks empty. The Americans destroyed or captured 82 tanks and 47 artillery pieces without significant resistance. The equipment that Germany could not manufacture fast enough to replace was being abandoned because Germany could not fuel it. By early January, the pattern was repeating across the entire salient. German units that had advanced aggressively in mid-December were now immobile from fuel exhaustion. Units that had fuel were immobile from mechanical breakdown. Sustained combat operations without adequate maintenance had broken vehicles faster than field repair shops could fix them. Units that had fuel and functioning vehicles were immobile from Allied air attacks that made daylight movement suicidal. The offensive that had been designed as a mobile armored thrust had devolved into static defensive warfare under conditions that heavily favored the enemy. German soldiers dug into frozen ground and waited for American artillery or air attacks that came with systematic regularity. The ammunition situation compounded the fuel crisis. German artillery, which had opened the offensive with 18,000 shells in 90 minutes, was now rationed to 20 rounds per gun per day. Infantry units that had expended ammunition freely during the breakthrough were now ordered to conserve every round. American forces, by contrast, operated under no such constraints. American artillery fired thousands of rounds daily. American infantry had ammunition to suppress any target they identified. The firepower imbalance meant that German defensive positions were systematically destroyed by American artillery before American infantry attacked. German soldiers, holding positions without adequate ammunition to return fire, could only endure bombardment and hope to survive. January 3rd, 1945, Hitler finally authorized what his field commanders had been requesting for 2 weeks: withdrawal. But the authorization came with conditions that made organized retreat nearly impossible. German forces would withdraw slowly, contesting every position, destroying everything that could not be carried. No territory would be given up without fighting for it. The withdrawal would be a fighting retreat that consumed the very resources retreat was supposed to preserve. Model and von Manteuffel, receiving these orders, understood they were being asked to destroy their own armies slowly rather than quickly. But orders were orders, even when orders guaranteed disaster. The retreat exposed German forces to the full weight of Allied air power. Roads that German forces had used for advance in fog and snow were now choke points where Allied fighter bombers could find targets in clear weather. Convoys that moved at night to avoid air attack moved so slowly that they covered perhaps 5 miles between dusk and dawn. Vehicles that broke down were abandoned. Wounded soldiers who could not walk were left behind with medical orderlies who became prisoners. The retreat became a rout in sectors where American pressure was strongest. German soldiers, exhausted from 3 weeks of combat in freezing temperatures with inadequate food and no prospect of relief, simply stopped fighting and surrendered. The capture rates climbed. Divisions that had started the offensive with 15,000 men ended it with 5,000. January 8th. American and British forces advancing from north and south met at Houffalize, a Belgian town that marked the deepest point of German penetration. The meeting symbolized the closing of the salient and the restoration of the Allied line. The bulge, the protrusion in Allied lines that gave the battle its popular name, was eliminated. The front was restored to approximately where it had been on December 15th, with the exception that now German forces occupied defensive positions they had not spent months preparing. The territory that Germany had gained in 2 weeks of offensive operations was lost in 2 weeks of defensive retreat. The net territorial change was approximately zero. The casualties were decidedly not zero. The final accounting documented a catastrophe. German losses totaled approximately 100,000 casualties, 20,000 killed, 60,000 wounded, 20,000 captured. Tank and assault gun losses exceeded 800 vehicles. Artillery losses approached 1,000 guns. Luftwaffe losses from the Bodenplatte operation added another 300 aircraft and 200 pilots. These were losses Germany could not replace. The strategic reserve that had been accumulated for the Ardennes Offensive was destroyed. The divisions that had conducted the offensive existed on paper, but were shadows of their former strength. Most critically, the time consumed in the Ardennes, 4 weeks of sustained combat, had prevented those forces from being available when the Soviet Union launched its winter offensive in mid-January. The gamble in the West had failed, and the price was paid in the East. American and British losses were also severe. 89,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed. Tank losses approached 700 vehicles. The Ardennes was the bloodiest battle American forces fought in Western Europe, exceeding even the Normandy campaign in intensity and casualties. But American losses, while significant, were sustainable. American factories were producing thousands of tanks per month. The replacement pipeline delivered trained soldiers to Europe continuously. Within 3 weeks of the battle's end, American losses were replaced. German losses were permanent. The mathematics of industrial warfare were unforgiving. The side that could replace losses faster would win wars of attrition. The Ardennes had been precisely such a war, and Germany had lost catastrophically. The collapse revealed what should have been obvious from the beginning. Modern armored warfare requires fuel, ammunition, and air superiority. Germany had attempted to conduct mobile operations without adequate fuel, had tried to sustain combat without sufficient ammunition, and had operated under enemy air superiority. Any one of these deficiencies should have prevented the offensive from being launched. All three together made failure inevitable. The offensive had not been defeated by superior Allied tactics or brilliant generalship. It had been defeated by arithmetic. German forces consumed resources faster than they could be replaced or captured. American forces received resources faster than they could consume them. The outcome was determined before the first shot was fired. The final irony was that the Ardennes offensive achieved the opposite of Hitler's strategic intention. The operation was supposed to split the Anglo-American alliance, cause political crisis in Washington and London, and force the Western Allies to negotiate. Instead, it unified Allied command under crisis conditions, demonstrated Allied logistical superiority, and convinced Allied populations that Germany remained dangerous and had to be utterly defeated. The offensive that was supposed to buy time instead consumed time Germany needed for defensive preparations. The operation that was supposed to preserve German forces instead destroyed them. And the gamble that was supposed to change the war's trajectory instead accelerated German defeat. By early January 1945, Allied forces were preparing offensives into Germany itself. The Rhine River, the last major defensive barrier, would be crossed within months, and the forces Germany might have used to defend the Rhine had been consumed in the Ardennes, achieving nothing except their own destruction. The collapse was complete. The defeat was comprehensive, and the end, which might have been delayed through careful defensive operations, was now inevitable and imminent. January 3rd, 1945, 10 o'clock in the morning. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood before maps at his headquarters in Zonhoven, Belgium, and explained to his staff officers why the northern counteroffensive would proceed methodically rather than aggressively. American commanders, particularly Patton, were attacking from the south with characteristic energy and accepting casualties as the price of rapid advance. Montgomery's approach would be different. British and American forces under his temporary command would attack with careful preparation, overwhelming artillery support, and measured advances that minimized casualties. speed was less important than certainty. Montgomery had spent the past 2 weeks straightening lines, accumulating reserves, and preparing defensive positions that could absorb any German counterattacks. Now he would transition to offense, but on his terms and his timeline. His staff officers, accustomed to Montgomery's methodical approach, recognized this would be effective but slow. What they could not anticipate was that Montgomery's caution would create a political crisis that nearly destroyed Allied unity. The military logic of Montgomery's approach was sound. German forces in the northern sector had achieved minimal penetration but remained dangerous. The 6th SS Panzer Army, though stalled, still possessed combat power. Attacking aggressively against prepared positions invited casualties without guaranteeing success. Montgomery's preference was to use artillery and air power to destroy German positions, then advance with infantry supported by armor against weakened defenses. This was the same methodology that had served British forces well in North Africa and Normandy. It preserved combat power, reduced casualties, and achieved objectives with certainty. The problem was that American commanders, operating under different doctrinal principles, viewed Montgomery's caution as timidity and his careful preparations as delay. January 4th. Montgomery's northern offensive began with 3 days of artillery preparation. British and American guns pounded German positions around the northern shoulder of the salient. The bombardment was heavy and sustained, but the advance that followed was measured in miles per day rather than tens of miles. German forces, already planning withdrawal, contested each position briefly, then fell back to successive defensive lines. Montgomery's forces advanced 3 to 5 miles per day, perfectly acceptable by British standards, frustratingly slow by American standards. Bradley, commanding American forces in the South, and theoretically Montgomery's equal in the command structure, complained to Eisenhower that Montgomery was moving like molasses in January. The comparison was apt, though Bradley intended it as criticism rather than description. The tension between Montgomery's methodical approach and American aggressive doctrine reflected deeper cultural differences in how the two nations waged war. British military doctrine, shaped by centuries of fighting continental wars with limited manpower, emphasized preserving forces and achieving objectives with minimum casualties. American doctrine, shaped by vast industrial capacity and replacement pipelines, emphasized speed and accepting casualties as the cost of rapid decision. Neither approach was inherently superior, but the combination of both within a single command structure created friction. Montgomery's caution looked like overcaution to American commanders, who had just watched Patton pivot an entire army in 72 hours. American aggressiveness looked like recklessness to British commanders, who calculated casualties in terms of irreplaceable soldiers. January 7th. Montgomery held a press conference that transformed military disagreement into political crisis. Speaking to British and American journalists, Montgomery described his role in containing the German offensive. His words, intended to praise Anglo-American cooperation, came across as claiming credit for saving American forces from disaster. He stated that when the German attack came, I employed the whole available power of the British group of armies, implying that British forces had rescued Americans from a situation they could not handle themselves. He praised American soldiers, but implied their commanders had failed them. The British press, eager for good news and perhaps for validation of British contributions to a campaign dominated by American forces, printed Montgomery's comments prominently. The American press and American commanders exploded with rage. The factual record contradicted Montgomery's implication. Of the divisions engaged in the Ardennes battle, 18 were American and 2 were British. American forces had borne 90% of the casualties and conducted 90% of the combat operations. Montgomery had commanded the northern sector, but had commanded primarily American forces in that sector. His actual contribution was establishing a defensive line and coordinating reserves. Important work, but hardly the decisive factor he implied it was. American commanders who had fought for 3 weeks to contain and defeat the German offensive were furious that Montgomery was claiming credit for their soldiers' sacrifice. Bradley threatened to resign if Montgomery remained in command of American forces. Patton's comments about Montgomery, recorded in his diary, were unprintable. Eisenhower found himself managing a command crisis at the moment of military victory. He had given Montgomery temporary command of Northern forces because it was militarily necessary and operationally sound. Now that decision was threatening to fracture Allied unity. British and American press were trading accusations. Commanders were threatening resignation. National pride, always present but usually sublimated to military necessity, was asserting itself in ways that could damage the alliance. Eisenhower's solution was diplomatic and firm. He publicly praised both Montgomery's coordination and American combat effectiveness, privately told Montgomery that future press conferences would be cleared through Supreme Headquarters, and returned command of American forces to Bradley as soon as the battlefield situation stabilized. The crisis was contained but not resolved. The damage to Allied relations lingered. January 16th. British and American forces met at Houffalize, symbolically closing the bulge and eliminating the salient. Photographs showed British and American officers shaking hands, but the smiles were forced and the handshakes tense. Montgomery's methodical advance from the north had succeeded in its objective, but had taken 2 weeks to advance 20 miles. Patton's aggressive attacks from the south had advanced 30 miles in the same period while taking heavier casualties. Both approaches had worked, but the contrast reinforced stereotypes. British caution versus American boldness. British concern for casualties versus American willingness to accept losses. British methodical certainty versus American aggressive risk-taking. Neither stereotype was entirely fair or entirely wrong, and both contributed to Allied command tensions that persisted until the war's end. The political consequences of Montgomery's press conference extended beyond hurt feelings and damaged egos. Churchill, recognizing that Montgomery's comments had created a crisis, delivered a speech to Parliament on January 18th, explicitly praising American soldiers and their contribution to the Ardennes battle. The speech was generous and accurate, acknowledging that Americans had borne the vast majority of casualties and conducted the vast majority of combat operations. But the fact that such a speech was necessary revealed how close the alliance had come to serious fracture. Military operations had succeeded. Political unity had been stressed to breaking points. The Ardennes Offensive, intended by Hitler to split the Anglo-American alliance, had not succeeded in that objective. But Montgomery's claim to credit had nearly accomplished what German panzer divisions could not. The controversy revealed a fundamental tension in coalition warfare. Credit is finite and must be shared. Montgomery's effectiveness as a commander was unquestionable. He had straightened lines, established reserves, prevented panic, and coordinated a successful defensive operation. But effectiveness did not entitle him to disproportionate credit for a battle that American forces had primarily fought and American casualties had primarily paid for. The lesson, which future coalition operations would repeatedly rediscover, was that managing Allied egos was as important as managing military operations. Victory required not just defeating the enemy, but maintaining unity among allies whose national interests, command cultures, and public relations needs sometimes conflicted. By the end of January, the Ardennes battle was over, and the command structure had been reorganized. Montgomery returned to commanding 21st Army Group. Bradley retained command of 12th Army Group. Eisenhower continued as Supreme Commander, now more aware than ever that his role required diplomatic skills as much as military judgment. The battle had been won. The alliance had survived. But the tensions revealed during the Ardennes would influence command relationships for the remainder of the war. Montgomery and Bradley would never fully trust each other again. British and American commanders would approach coalition operations with wariness about credit and recognition. And future historians would debate not just who won the Battle of the Bulge, but who deserved credit for winning it. A debate that, more than 70 years later, continues without definitive resolution. The military victory was clear. The political victory remained contentious. And the lesson, that wars are won by soldiers but remembered through narratives constructed by commanders and journalists, was reinforced once again. May 7, 1945. The war in Europe was over, Germany had surrendered, and Allied intelligence officers were beginning the process of interviewing captured German commanders. In a detention facility near Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg, Major Kenneth Strong of British intelligence sat across a table from Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and asked a question that had been troubling Allied analysts for months. What were German commanders thinking when they launched the Ardennes Offensive? Von Rundstedt, 70 years old and exhausted from years of war, provided an answer that was simultaneously candid and damning. He said the offensive had been doomed from the start. The fuel did not exist. The air cover was absent. The timeline was impossible. He had told Hitler this in October. Model had told Hitler. Manteuffel had told Hitler. The quartermaster officers had documented the impossibility in detailed reports. The offensive proceeded anyway because Hitler willed it, and in Nazi Germany, the Führer's will superseded mathematics, logistics, and military judgment. Von Rundstedt's conclusion was simple. The offensive failed because it attempted modern mobile warfare with inadequate resources. Everything else, tactics, casualties, individual battles, was footnote to that central failure. The mathematical verdict was unambiguous, and had been unambiguous before the offensive began. German forces required 12 million gallons of fuel to reach Antwerp. They started with 4.5 million gallons. They captured 50,000 gallons from American stocks. They consumed approximately 3 million gallons during the offensive. The fuel deficit, the gap between requirement and availability, was roughly 8 million gallons. No amount of tactical success, operational skill, or soldier courage could bridge that gap. The offensive was not defeated in battle so much as it exhausted itself through consumption. Tanks did not stop because they were destroyed. They stopped because fuel gauges read empty. The furthest German advance reached 54% of the distance to Antwerp. The offensive consumed 100% of its planned timeline. The mathematics were brutal and clear. Germany attempted to cover 120 miles with fuel sufficient for 60 miles, hoped to capture the difference, failed, and stopped when physics made further movement impossible. The timeline analysis revealed similar mathematical impossibility. German planning called for reaching Antwerp by day 14. The plan assumed advancing approximately 9 miles per day through enemy territory in winter. This assumption required that German forces would move faster than Americans could respond, that roads would support rapid movement, that bridges would not be demolished, that fuel would be captured, that weather would remain bad, and that Allied reinforcements would be slow to arrive. Every assumption proved wrong. German forces averaged 3 miles per day of advance during the first 10 days, then began retreating. The deepest penetration reached by day 12, approximately 65 miles, fell far short of the Meuse River at 80 miles, which itself was only halfway to Antwerp. The timeline failure was not marginal. It was catastrophic. Germany was not slightly behind schedule. Germany was attempting to achieve in 14 days what required 40 days even under optimal conditions that never existed. The air power equation provided the third element of mathematical failure. German planning assumed 7 to 10 days of bad weather, during which Allied aircraft would be grounded. The forecast proved accurate. Germany received 7 days of cloud cover and fog, but 7 days proved insufficient. Reaching the Meuse required at least 10 days. Reaching Antwerp required 14. When weather cleared on December 23rd, German forces were still 30 miles from the Meuse and 60 miles from Antwerp, fully exposed to Allied air attack, with no prospect of reaching objectives before air superiority devastated their formations. The Luftwaffe's attempt to contest air superiority through Operation Bodenplatte failed catastrophically, losing 300 aircraft and 200 pilots to destroy 300 Allied aircraft that were replaced within a week. After Bodenplatte, German forces operated under complete Allied air superiority, unable to move in daylight, unable to be resupplied effectively, and unable to maneuver against American ground attacks. The window of bad weather was both too short and ultimately irrelevant. Even with 14 days of clouds, German fuel supplies would not have sustained advance to Antwerp. The strategic cost of the Ardennes offensive extended far beyond the immediate losses. Germany committed its last operational reserves to an offensive that failed to achieve any strategic objective. Those reserves, approximately 250,000 men, 1,000 tanks, and 1,800 aircraft, were destroyed or depleted to ineffectiveness. The forces that might have defended the Rhine River in February and March were instead consumed in the Ardennes in December and January. The soldiers who might have delayed Soviet advances in Poland and East Prussia were committed to a failed offensive in the West. The equipment that might have equipped defensive formations was abandoned in Belgian forests when fuel ran out. Germany traded its strategic reserve for a 65-mile advance that was reversed within 3 weeks. The exchange rate was catastrophically negative. The Eastern Front consequences of the Ardennes Offensive were immediate and severe. General Guderian's warnings in December proved accurate. On January 12, 1945, Soviet forces launched their winter offensive against German positions in Poland. The offensive employed 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and overwhelming artillery support. German defenses, stripped of reserves sent west for the Ardennes, collapsed within days. By February, Soviet forces had advanced 300 miles and were within 100 miles of Berlin. The strategic reserve that might have slowed or stopped the Soviet offensive had been consumed in the Ardennes, achieving nothing. Hitler's gamble to force a decision in the West instead accelerated defeat in the East. The war that might have lasted until summer 1945, if Germany had defended conservatively, instead ended in May because Germany had no reserves remaining to conduct defensive operations. The what-if question haunted German commanders in captivity and historians subsequently. What would have happened if Germany had used Ardennes forces defensively rather than offensively? The answer, while speculative, suggested by virtually all analysts, was that Germany might have prolonged the war by 3 to 6 months. Defensive operations consume fewer resources than offensive operations. Defenders benefit from prepared positions, shorter supply lines, and ability to mass fires rather than forces. If Germany had positioned Ardennes forces to defend the Rhine River and the approaches to the Ruhr industrial region, Allied offensives in spring 1945 might have been delayed or more costly. If Germany had retained reserves to reinforce the Eastern Front, Soviet advances might have been slower. The war's ultimate outcome would not have changed. Germany's defeat was inevitable once it faced enemies with superior resources on multiple fronts. But the timeline might have been extended. The Ardennes offensive traded possible delay for certain acceleration of defeat. The irony was that Hitler's strategic reasoning, while flawed, was not entirely irrational. Germany in December 1944 faced inevitable defeat through attrition. Defensive operations would delay, but not prevent loss. An offensive that split the Anglo-American alliance or captured Antwerp might, in theory, force political changes that would allow Germany to negotiate from a position of strength rather than unconditional surrender. The strategy was rational. The execution was impossible. The resources required to achieve strategic objectives did not exist. The plan assumed capabilities Germany no longer possessed: fuel abundance, air superiority, operational reserves, and enemy incompetence. When reality failed to conform to assumptions, the plan did not adapt. It continued until physical impossibility forced termination. This was not strategy failing. This was delusion, disguised as strategy. The final accounting revealed losses that Germany could not sustain and achievements that did not justify those losses. Germany suffered approximately 100,000 casualties, lost 800 tanks and assault guns, expended its remaining fuel reserves, destroyed the Luftwaffe's operational capability, and consumed its strategic reserve. In exchange, Germany gained nothing. Antwerp remained in Allied hands. The Anglo-American alliance remained intact. Allied offensives were delayed by approximately 6 weeks, time that Germany might have purchased more cheaply through defensive operations. The captured territory was retaken. The political impact was opposite of intended. Rather than forcing negotiations, the offensive convinced Allied populations that Germany remained dangerous and unconditional surrender was necessary. By any measure, strategic, operational, tactical, or political, the Ardennes Offensive was a comprehensive failure. The verdict history rendered was unanimous and damning. German commanders who survived the war uniformly described the Ardennes Offensive as a mistake that accelerated German defeat. Allied commanders recognized it as a shock, but not a crisis, a tactical setback that became a strategic opportunity. Military historians analyzed it as a case study in how not to conduct offensive operations, attacking without adequate resources, assuming enemy incompetence, depending on uncontrollable factors like weather, and refusing to adapt when initial assumptions proved wrong. The offensive failed for a single reason that subsumed all other reasons. Germany attempted 1940-style blitzkrieg warfare with 1945 resources. Mobile warfare requires mobility, which requires fuel. Germany lacked fuel. The offense, therefore, lacked mobility. Everything that followed, tactical failures, logistics breakdowns, casualties, defeat, flowed from that central insufficiency. The soldiers who fought the battle, on both sides, understood the truth that commanders sometimes obscured. The Ardennes was a battle that should never have been fought. German soldiers advanced until fuel ran out, then surrendered or died when American counterattacks arrived. American soldiers died retaking territory that Germany could not hold and should not have taken. The casualties on both sides, American, British, and German, totaled approximately 190,000. The material losses included thousands of vehicles, aircraft, and artillery pieces. The time consumed was 4 weeks of intensive combat in brutal winter conditions. And the result was a front line in mid-January 1945 that was approximately where it had been in mid-December 1944, except now Germany lacked reserves to defend anywhere. The battle was futile, costly, and emblematic of how nations in terminal strategic decline make decisions that accelerate rather than delay their defeat. The Ardennes Offensive failed because failure was inevitable when plans required resources that did not exist. Mathematics cannot be defeated through courage, willpower, or tactical skill. Germany learned this lesson expensively. The soldiers who fought in the frozen forests of the Ardennes paid the tuition for that education, and history recorded the lesson for future generations. When strategy diverges from resources, reality always wins.